The morning air hung crisp and still over the Rocky Mountain wilderness when Jake Morrison first heard the distant rumble. As a veteran park ranger with 15 years patrolling these Colorado peaks, he knew the sound immediately: avalanche. The low, thunderous growl echoed off canyon walls, growing louder until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath his snowshoes. Jake paused on the narrow trail, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid February air. He'd been making his weekly patrol of the backcountry when the mountain decided to unleash its fury. Through the sparse pine trees ahead, he could see the massive white cloud of snow and debris billowing upward like smoke from an explosion. The silence that followed was absolute and unnerving. No bird calls, no wind through the branches, no scurrying of small creatures through the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see what destruction the avalanche had wrought. Jake quickened his pace toward the slide zone, his heavy boots crunching through the crusted snow. 23 years of living in these mountains had taught him that avalanches rarely traveled alone. After slides were common, and the unstable snow conditions that caused one slide often triggered others. But something pulled him forward, a ranger's instinct that lives might hang in the balance. As he crested a small ridge, the devastation spread before him like a war zone. The avalanche had carved a swath nearly 200 yards wide down the mountainside, stripping away mature pines and aspens as if they were matchsticks. Boulders the size of automobiles lay scattered across the debris field, mixed with twisted tree trunks and chunks of ice. The slide had come to rest in a natural bowl, creating a chaotic landscape of white and brown devastation. Steam rose from several spots where the friction of the moving snow had generated enough heat to melt patches of the debris. The acrid smell of broken vegetation and disturbed earth filled the air. Jake began methodically working his way across the slide zone, probing with his avalanche pole and listening intently for any signs of life. Mountain goats and elk sometimes got caught in these slides, and occasionally, despite all warnings and closures, a backcountry skier or snowshoe would find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd been searching for nearly an hour when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind. But there was no wind. Jake froze, tilting his head and straining his ears. There it was again, barely audible above the settling creaks and groans of the debris field. A soft whimpering, almost like a child crying. Following the sound led him toward a massive pile of snow and splintered trees near the avalanche's terminus. The whimpering grew stronger as he approached, definitely coming from somewhere beneath the debris. Jake began digging frantically with his hands and probe, following the sound like a lifeline. 3 feet down, his gloved fingers touched something warm and furry. The whimpering turned to weak growls and struggles. Jake's heart sank as he realized what he'd found. A wolf pup, probably no more than 6 months old, trapped under a lattice of broken branches and compressed snow. The animal was barely visible in the dim light filtering through the debris, its dark fur matted with ice and blood. One of its front paws appeared to be pinned beneath a heavy branch, and the pup's breathing came in short, labored gasps. Its golden eyes, wide with pain and terror, fixed on Jake's face with an intensity that was almost human. Jake sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Protocol was clear. Wild animals should be left alone, even injured ones. Interfering with natural processes was against everything he'd been trained to believe as a ranger. Wolves were apex predators, dangerous even as juveniles, and this one belonged to a pack that might be nearby. But looking into those desperate eyes, Jake felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just another wild animal. This was a creature fighting for its life, trapped through no fault of its own in a disaster that could have claimed any living thing in its path. The pup couldn't be more than 25 pounds, small enough that it posed no immediate threat, yet large enough that abandoning it to die felt like a betrayal of everything decent in the world. The whimpering had grown weaker during Jake's internal debate, and he could see the pup's strength failing. Whatever decision he was going to make needed to happen now. Jake began clearing away the debris with renewed urgency, working carefully to avoid further injuring the trapped animal. The pup growled weakly as Jake's hands came near, but lacked the energy for any real resistance. Branch by branch, chunk of snow by chunk, Jake excavated a path to freedom. When he finally lifted the last piece of wood away from the pup's pinned leg, the animal tried to scramble away, but collapsed immediately. The injured paw hung at an odd angle, clearly damaged but not completely severed. Blood matted the fur around several small cuts, and the pup's ribs showed prominently beneath its winter coat. Jake removed his heavy parka and carefully wrapped the shivering animal inside it. The pup struggled briefly, then seemed to recognize the warmth and settled into exhausted stillness. Its breathing remained shallow and rapid, but at least it was breathing. The trek back to his ranger station took nearly 2 hours, with Jake moving slowly to avoid jostling his unexpected passenger. The pup remained quiet during the journey, occasionally opening its eyes to study Jake's face with that same unsettling intelligence. As Jake's small cabin came into view through the trees, he wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. He had no experience caring for wild animals, especially wolves, and no idea if the pup would even survive the night. But looking down at the small bundle in his arms, Jake knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. The avalanche had taken its usual toll on the mountain that day. Trees, rocks, and earth rearranged according to gravity's ancient law. But it had also delivered something unexpected into Jake's ordered world, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the wilderness he'd spent his life protecting. As snowflakes began to fall again, Jake carried his burden through the cabin door and into an uncertain future they would face together. Inside the warmth of his cabin, Jake laid the wolf pup on a thick wool blanket near the wood stove. The animal's breathing had steadied during the journey, but its condition remained precarious. Jake switched on every lamp in the small room, needing to see exactly what he was dealing with. The pup's injuries were more extensive than he'd initially realized. The trapped front paw showed obvious swelling and an unnatural bend in what Jake guessed was the radius bone. Dark blood had dried around several lacerations on the animal's flanks, likely from being dragged across sharp debris during the avalanche. Most concerning was the pup's overall condition. Its ribs protruded sharply beneath matted fur, suggesting it had been separated from its pack and struggling to survive even before the slide. Jake knelt beside the motionless form, his hands hovering uncertainly over the injured animal. His first aid training covered human emergencies, not wildlife medicine, but the basics had to be similar: stop bleeding, stabilize fractures, prevent shock. The pup's golden eyes tracked Jake's movements with wary intelligence. When Jake gently touched the injured paw, the animal's lips pulled back in a weak snarl, revealing needle-sharp puppy teeth. The leg was definitely broken. The bone shifted out of alignment beneath the swollen tissue. Working slowly and speaking in low, reassuring tones, Jake began cleaning the visible wounds with warm water and antiseptic from his medical kit. The pup flinched at first contact, but seemed to understand that Jake meant no harm. Its breathing remained rapid and shallow, but the panicked edge had faded. The broken leg required immediate attention. Jake had splinted human fractures before, but never on an animal. He retrieved wooden paint stirrers from his workshop and torn strips from an old cotton shirt. The pup watched his preparations with those unsettling eyes, as if evaluating Jake's competence. Immobilizing the fracture proved more challenging than expected. The pup's leg was thinner than a human arm, but more muscular, and the animal's instinctive resistance to restraint complicated every movement. Jake worked with infinite patience, pausing whenever the pup showed signs of distress, gradually earning enough tolerance to position the splint properly. When he finished wrapping the makeshift cast, the pup examined its bandaged limb with what seemed like curiosity rather than alarm. Jake interpreted this as a positive sign. The animal appeared to recognize that the splint reduced its pain rather than increased it. The immediate crisis addressed, Jake turned his attention to longer-term care. The pup needed food, but what did 6-month-old wolves eat? His emergency supplies included canned chicken and beef, neither ideal for a wild predator, but potentially acceptable given the circumstances. Jake opened a can of chicken and mashed it into small pieces, adding warm water to create a soupy mixture. He placed a small bowl near the pup's head and waited. The animal sniffed the offering suspiciously, then turned away with obvious disgust. For the next hour, Jake tried various combinations: plain meat, meat with water, even small pieces offered by hand. The pup refused everything, growing more agitated with each attempt. Jake began to worry that the animal might starve rather than accept food from human hands. As evening deepened, Jake prepared his own dinner, hoping the smell of cooking might stimulate the pup's appetite. He grilled a venison steak left over from hunting season, the rich aroma filling the small cabin. For the first time since the rescue, the pup showed interest in food, lifting its head and testing the air with obvious hunger. Jake cut a small portion of the barely cooked meat and offered it on a wooden spoon. The pup sniffed cautiously, then took a tentative bite. Encouraged, Jake cut the meat smaller and placed pieces directly on the blanket near the animal's muzzle. The pup ate slowly but steadily, pausing frequently to rest, but eventually consuming nearly 2 ounces of venison. When finished, it laid its head back down and closed its eyes, the first truly relaxed posture Jake had witnessed since the rescue. Jake spent the night on his couch, waking every few hours to check on his patient. The pup slept fitfully, occasionally whimpering or moving restlessly, but its breathing remained stable and the bleeding had stopped completely. By morning, subtle changes were evident. The animal's eyes seemed brighter, more alert, and it showed interest in its surroundings rather than simply enduring them. When Jake approached with another offering of venison, the pup accepted the food without the previous suspicion. The real test came when Jake needed to change the bandages on the pup's wounds. The animal tensed as Jake approached, but didn't attempt to bite or flee. It watched intently as Jake unwrapped the splint, examined the swollen paw, and rewrapped it with fresh materials. The fracture showed no obvious signs of infection, though the swelling had increased overnight, a normal response to injury. Jake had no way to determine if the bone was healing properly, but the pup's willingness to bear slight weight on the leg suggested the alignment wasn't completely wrong. Over the following days, a routine developed. Jake would wake early, check the pup's condition, and offer food before beginning his own morning routine. The animal grew stronger each day, its appetite increasing and its wounds beginning to heal cleanly. The pup's personality emerged gradually. It was intensely observant, tracking Jake's movements around the cabin with constant attention. It seemed to understand cause and effect remarkably quickly, learning that the sound of the can opener meant food, that Jake's approach with the medical kit meant bandage changes, that certain tones of voice indicated approval or concern. Most remarkably, the pup showed no fear of Jake despite its wild nature. It didn't seek affection like a domestic dog might, but it also didn't cringe or hide when Jake approached. Instead, it maintained a watchful neutrality, as if reserving judgment about this strange human who had pulled it from certain death. By the end of the first week, the pup was attempting to stand on its injured leg. The splint prevented normal movement, but the animal could support its weight briefly and take a few awkward steps. Jake interpreted this as evidence that the bone was healing properly. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a dying animal trapped in avalanche debris was becoming a vital, intelligent creature with its own distinct personality. Jake found himself looking forward to their daily interactions, fascinated by the pup's responses and rapid learning. But questions nagged at him during quiet moments. What would happen when a leg healed completely? Could a wolf raised in captivity, even briefly, successfully return to the wild? Did the pup's pack still roam these mountains? And would they accept back a member that smelled of humans? For now, those questions could wait. The pup was alive, healing, and growing stronger each day. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jake had bought them time to figure out solutions. As he watched the young wolf carefully navigate around the cabin on 3.5 legs, Jake allowed himself to feel a cautious optimism about their shared future. 2 weeks into their cohabitation, the fragile truce between Jake and the wolf pup shattered without warning. What had seemed like growing trust revealed itself as mere tolerance born of weakness and dependency. As the pup's strength returned, so did its wild instincts and deep-seated suspicion of humans. The change began subtly. The pup started refusing food from Jake's hand, only eating when he placed the bowl across the room and retreated to a safe distance. It would wait until Jake was occupied with other tasks before approaching the food, as if accepting charity from a human was somehow shameful. Then came the aggression. When Jake approached to change the bandages on the healing wounds, the pup's lips would curl back in warning, revealing those sharp puppy teeth in unmistakable threat. The first time it actually snapped at Jake's reaching hand. Missing fingers by mere inches, Jake realized how dramatically their relationship had shifted. The pup no longer slept peacefully near the warm stove. Instead, it positioned itself in the corner farthest from Jake's bed, watching him with eyes that reflected the lamplight like golden coins in the darkness. Jake would wake in the night to find those eyes fixed on him, evaluating, calculating, never quite hostile, but never trusting either. Jake tried various approaches to rebuild their connection. He spoke to the animal in soft, reassuring tones, offering choice cuts of meat and maintaining respectful distance during feeding times. The pup accepted these overtures with the same wary calculation it showed toward everything else, neither grateful nor openly defiant. The daily bandage changes became elaborate negotiations. Jake would approach slowly, hands visible, speaking in low voices about his intentions as if the pup could understand English. Sometimes the animal would tolerate the medical attention. Other times it would retreat to its corner and refuse to emerge until Jake gave up and returned to his own activities. What troubled Jake most wasn't the aggression itself, but the intelligence behind it. This wasn't the random hostility of a frightened animal. The pup's responses were measured and purposeful, as if it had made conscious decisions about what behavior would best serve its interests. It would accept medical care when pain made resistance pointless, but assert its independence whenever possible. During mealtimes, the pup developed increasingly complex rituals around accepting food. It would watch Jake prepare the meat from across the room, waiting until the human had not just retreated, but actually left the immediate area. Only then would it approach the bowl, eat quickly and efficiently, and return to its corner before Jake could observe the feeding process. Jake began to understand that he wasn't caring for an injured pet that would eventually become grateful and affectionate. He was harboring a wild predator whose survival instincts included deep wariness of humans. Every kindness he offered was evaluated not as friendship, but as potential threat or manipulation. The revelation came during a routine attempt to check the splinted leg. Jake had approached with his usual caution, speaking softly and moving slowly. The pup had remained still, allowing Jake to begin unwrapping the bandages. But when Jake's fingers probed gently around the healing fracture, the pup exploded into motion. It didn't just snap or growl. It launched itself at Jake with surprising strength, teeth aimed directly at his throat. Only Jake's reflexes, honed by years of wilderness work, saved him from serious injury. He threw himself backward, landing hard against the cabin wall as the pup crashed to the floor where Jake had been kneeling. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small room. The pup's golden eyes held no apology, no recognition that it had just attempted to seriously harm its rescuer. Instead, Jake saw something that chilled him, the cold calculation of a predator evaluating whether to press its attack. Jake remained perfectly still, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger another assault. The pup watched him for long seconds, then limped back to its corner and settled down as if nothing had happened. The message was unmistakable. The relationship existed on the animal's terms, and those terms could change without notice. That night, Jake lay awake reconsidering everything he thought he understood about their situation. The pup wasn't healing from trauma and learning to trust. It was recovering its strength and reasserting its natural dominance patterns. Jake had inadvertently challenged that dominance by insisting on medical examinations and feeding schedules. The next morning brought a new approach. Instead of trying to impose structure, Jake began following the pup's lead. He placed food where the animal could access it independently, maintained greater distance during all interactions, and stopped attempting unwanted medical attention unless absolutely necessary. The pup responded to these changes with what Jake interpreted as grudging approval. It began venturing further from its corner, exploring the cabin with growing confidence. It would even tolerate Jake's presence in the same room, though always maintaining escape routes and carefully monitoring his movements. Jake started to appreciate the complexity of the animal psychology. This wasn't simple hostility. It was the measured wariness of an intelligent creature maintaining its independence while accepting necessary assistance. The pup had no desire to bond with humans, but it was pragmatic enough to accept help when survival required it. Watching the pup navigate around the cabin on its healing leg, Jake began to see behaviors that spoke to sophisticated intelligence. The animal had mapped every entrance and exit, identified the locations of all potential weapons or tools, and established multiple retreat positions throughout the small space. It wasn't just living in Jake's cabin, it was conducting ongoing surveillance. The bandage changes became less frequent as the wounds healed, reducing their points of conflict. When medical attention was absolutely necessary, Jake learned to wait for moments when the pup was relaxed and approach with elaborate respect for its personal space. The animal would submit to necessary care, but made clear that cooperation was a calculated decision, not surrender. By the third week, their coexistence had stabilized into an armed truce. The pup accepted Jake's presence and assistance while maintaining complete emotional independence. Jake provided food and shelter while respecting the animal's fundamental wildness. Yet despite the tension and mutual wariness, Jake found himself developing profound respect for his unusual house guest. The pup's refusal to be domesticated or to show gratitude actually impressed him more than simple affection would have. This animal had faced death, accepted help, and was now healing while never compromising its essential nature. Late at night, when the pup thought Jake was sleeping, he would sometimes catch glimpses of behavior that revealed the animal's youth. It would play with shadows cast by the firelight, or investigate interesting smells with the innocent curiosity of any young creature. But the moment it sensed Jake's attention, the wild wariness would return. Jake began to understand that their relationship wasn't about trust or affection. It was about mutual respect between two intelligent beings with very different natures. The pup would never be his friend, but it might someday be his partner in whatever challenges lay ahead. As March snow continued falling outside the cabin windows, Jake settled into this new reality. He was sharing his space not with a pet or a grateful rescue, but with a proud and independent creature that happened to need temporary assistance. The arrangement worked precisely because neither of them expected more than necessity demanded. The wolf pup was healing, growing stronger each day, and maintaining its essential wildness despite human contact. Jake couldn't have asked for a better outcome, even if it wasn't the outcome he had initially imagined. The breakthrough in their relationship came unexpectedly during a routine medical examination in early March. Jake had been monitoring the pup's healing progress with increasing optimism. The wounds had closed cleanly, leaving only thin scars beneath the growing fur, and the splinted leg showed definite signs of knitting properly. On this particular morning, Jake approached the bandage change with his usual caution. The pup had been more tolerant lately, perhaps recognizing that these sessions brought relief rather than pain. As Jake carefully unwrapped the splint, he discovered something remarkable. The swelling had completely subsided, and the leg appeared to have healed straight and strong. The pup seemed to sense the significance of this moment. Instead of its usual tense submission, it watched Jake's examination with something approaching interest. When Jake gently manipulated the formerly broken bone, testing its stability, the animal didn't flinch or growl. The leg felt solid, properly aligned, and ready to bear weight. Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Instead of rewrapping the splint, he set the bandaging materials aside and waited to see how the pup would react to its newfound freedom. The pup stared at its unbandaged leg for several seconds, as if unable to believe the restraint was truly gone. Tentatively, it flexed the previously immobilized joint, testing the range of motion. Finding no pain, it placed a paw on the ground and shifted weight onto it experimentally. What happened next surprised them both. The pup took 3 careful steps toward Jake, not away from him, and sat down just beyond arm's reach. It looked directly into Jake's eyes with an expression that seemed almost like acknowledgement. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition that Jake's actions had restored something important. For the first time since the rescue, the pup voluntarily remained in Jake's immediate vicinity without maintaining an escape route. It settled onto the cabin floor with its legs tucked beneath it, watching Jake organize the medical supplies with apparent calm. Jake interpreted this as a watershed moment. The animal had achieved the independence it craved, the ability to move freely without human assistance, and no longer felt the need to maintain constant defensive postures. The healing was complete, and with it came a subtle but significant shift in their dynamic. Over the following days, the pup began displaying behaviors Jake hadn't seen before. It would follow him around the cabin at a respectful distance, observing his daily routines with obvious curiosity. When Jake cooked meals, the pup would position itself where it could watch the entire process, studying human food preparation techniques with scientific interest. The animal's intelligence became increasingly apparent. It learned to anticipate Jake's schedules, positioning itself near the door when he prepared for his daily patrol duties, or settling near the stove before Jake began his evening cooking routine. It seemed to understand cause and effect relationships that would challenge many domestic animals. Most remarkably, the pup began responding to Jake's spoken words, not with the trained responses of a domestic dog, but with the thoughtful consideration of a creature trying to decode a foreign language. When Jake said food, the pup would look toward its feeding area. When he said outside, it it would glance at the door. The animal was actively studying human communication. Jake started talking to the pup more frequently, not expecting responses, but wanting to provide stimulation for its obviously active mind. He would narrate his activities, explain his plans for the day, or simply share his thoughts about weather and forest conditions. The pup listened to these one-sided conversations with focused attention, head tilted slightly as if trying to parse meaning from the unfamiliar sounds. The feeding relationship evolved as well. While the pup still maintained its independence around meals, it no longer fled to the far corner when Jake prepared its food. Instead, it would sit at a comfortable distance and watch the process, occasionally moving closer to investigate interesting smells. Jake began varying the pup's diet, introducing different types of meat and even some vegetables to see what preferences might emerge. The animal showed definite likes and dislikes, accepting venison and rabbit eagerly while rejecting pork and chicken. It seemed particularly interested in foods that Jake prepared for himself, as if human food choices carried some special significance. The most significant development was the emergence of play behavior. Jake first noticed it during a quiet evening when he was reading by the fire. The pup had been lying nearby, apparently resting, when it suddenly pounced on Jake's discarded sock. What followed was several minutes of elaborate sock wrestling that revealed the animal's youthful energy and natural playfulness. Jake remained perfectly still during this display, understanding that any attention from him might end the spontaneous game. The pup eventually grew bored with the sock and returned to its resting position, but the glimpse of normal puppy behavior was encouraging. The animal's psychological health was recovering along with its physical strength. These play sessions became more frequent and elaborate. The pup would investigate Jake's belongings when it thought he wasn't watching, batting at hanging towels or wrestling with dropped gloves. It seemed particularly fascinated by objects that carried Jake's scent, as if trying to understand this human through sensory analysis. Jake decided to test the boundaries of their relationship by introducing intentional play. He tossed a small stick across the cabin floor, not expecting the pup to fetch it like a dog, but curious about its response. The animal investigated the stick thoroughly, eventually picking it up and carrying it around the room before settling down to chew on it contentedly. The stick became the pup's first toy, something it would return to whenever boredom struck. Jake added other objects gradually, a rope, a tennis ball, various textures and shapes for exploration. The pup approached each new item with scientific curiosity, testing it for interesting smells, textures, and play potential. During these play sessions, Jake began to see the animal's personality emerging more clearly. It was methodical and thoughtful in its explorations, but also capable of sudden bursts of puppy-like enthusiasm. It preferred games that challenged its problem-solving abilities over simple physical activities. Jake started calling the pup Shadow during these interactions, partly because of its dark fur and partly because of its habit of following him around the cabin just outside direct sight. The name seemed to suit the animal's elusive but constant presence. Shadow's response to its name was initially neutral, but gradually Jake noticed the pup's ears would perk up when he said it. Whether this represented true name recognition or simple response to a frequently heard sound, Jake couldn't determine, but it felt like progress toward genuine communication. By late March, their relationship had transformed into something Jake had never experienced with any animal. Shadow wasn't a pet. It maintained too much independence and wild dignity for that classification. But it wasn't simply a temporary house guest either. It had become something more complex, a partner in an unusual domestic arrangement that suited both their needs. Jake found himself looking forward to his evenings at the cabin, curious about what new behaviors or responses Shadow might display. The animal had become genuinely interesting company, even without traditional affection or loyalty. Its intelligence and problem-solving abilities provided entertainment and intellectual stimulation that Jake hadn't realized he was missing. Most importantly, Shadow was gaining weight and strength daily. Its coat had regained its lustrous thickness. Its movements had become fluid and confident, and its overall condition suggested complete recovery from both the avalanche trauma and the period of separation from its pack. Jake knew that this healing process was approaching its natural conclusion. Shadow was becoming a healthy, capable young wolf, and soon the question of its future would demand answers. But for now, he was content to share his space with this remarkable creature and marvel at the complexity of their evolving relationship. The broken wolf pup from the avalanche debris had become Shadow, an intelligent and independent companion whose presence had enriched Jake's solitary existence in ways he was only beginning to understand. The first tentative step Shadow took on its fully healed leg marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one that would force both human and wolf to confront the inevitable question of the pup's future. Jake watched with mixed emotions as Shadow tested its restored mobility around the small cabin, moving with increasing confidence and grace. The transformation was remarkable. Where once a broken, frightened animal had cowered in corners, now a sleek young wolf padded silently across the wooden floors with natural dignity. Shadow's coat had regained its full winter thickness, the rich charcoal fur rippling over well-developed muscles. The golden eyes that had once held only pain and suspicion now sparkled with intelligence and barely contained energy. Jake's daily patrol routes had been shortened during Shadow's recovery, keeping him close to the cabin in case medical emergencies arose. But now he faced a decision: return to his normal ranging patterns and leave Shadow alone for extended periods, or continue the modified schedule that had accommodated their shared living arrangement. The choice was made for him when Shadow began showing signs of restlessness that coincided exactly with Jake's preparation for outdoor duties. The wolf would pace near the door when Jake gathered his gear, whining softly and fixing him with that intense golden stare that seemed to communicate complex thoughts. Jake interpreted these behaviors as a desire to venture outside, perhaps even to accompany him on patrol. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Shadow was still a young wolf, lacking the full physical development and survival skills of an adult, but it was also a wild predator whose instincts might reassert themselves unpredictably in its natural environment. The first test came on a crisp April morning when spring was beginning to soften the harsh mountain winter. Jake opened the cabin door as he did every morning to check weather conditions, but this time Shadow appeared beside him instantly, nose twitching at the flood of outdoor scents. Jake stepped onto a small porch, and Shadow followed without hesitation. The wolf's reaction to its first outdoor experience in months was immediate and profound. It stood motionless for several seconds, ears erect and rotating to capture every sound. Nostrils flared to process the overwhelming array of scents carried on the mountain breeze. Then Shadow took its first steps into the snow that surrounded the cabin, and Jake witnessed something that would remain etched in his memory forever. The wolf's entire demeanor changed, wild instincts awakening like dormant systems coming online. Its movements became fluid and purposeful, its attention focused on environmental details that Jake's human senses couldn't even detect. Shadow moved in expanding circles around the cabin, investigating scent marks, testing the wind, and occasionally pausing to lift its head and listen intently to sound from the surrounding forest. Jake remained on the porch, understanding that this was Shadow's moment of reconnection with its natural world. When a distant bird call echoed across the valley, Shadow's head snapped toward the sound with laser focus. When a squirrel chattered from a nearby pine, every muscle in the wolf's body coiled with predatory attention. These weren't the casual interests of a domestic animal. They were the survival responses of an apex predator awakening to its environment. Jake realized he was witnessing Shadow's transition from patient to wild animal, and the process was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The creature he had nursed back to health was remembering what it meant to be a wolf, and that memory didn't include dependence on humans. For the next hour, Shadow explored the immediate area around the cabin with methodical thoroughness. It investigated every tree, boulder, and depression in the snow, building a mental map of its territory. Jake noticed that the wolf always maintained awareness of his location, occasionally glancing back to ensure the human remained in sight, but its primary focus was on the wild environment. When Shadow approached the edge of the clearing, where denser forest began, Jake felt a stab of anxiety. If the wolf decided to disappear into those trees, Jake would have no way to follow or retrieve it. Shadow seemed to sense this boundary as well, pausing at the forest edge and looking back at Jake with an expression that might have been questioning. Jake made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of calling Shadow back to the cabin, he stepped down from the porch and began walking slowly toward the forest. Shadow watched his approach with obvious interest, tail held high in alert attention rather than defensive wariness. When Jake reached the tree line, Shadow moved to position itself roughly parallel to him, maintaining about 10 feet of distance. Together, they took their first steps into the forest that surrounded Jake's cabin, beginning what would become a new pattern in their relationship. The short hike revealed Shadow's remarkable adaptation to wilderness travel. Despite months of indoor living, the wolf moved through the forest with inherited grace, stepping silently over fallen logs and navigating around obstacles with economic efficiency. Jake, despite his years of wilderness experience, felt clumsy by comparison. Shadow's hunting instincts emerged gradually during these forest excursions. It would freeze at the scent of small game, muscles coiled in preparation for pursuit, then glance at Jake as if seeking permission or approval. Jake learned to remain perfectly still during these moments, allowing Shadow to make its own decisions about whether to pursue prey. The first successful hunt was a pivotal moment. Shadow had been tracking the scent of a rabbit for several minutes when the animal broke cover nearby. The wolf's response was pure instinct, a fluid leap that covered 15 feet in a single bound, followed by a quick, clean kill that spoke to genetic programming awakening after months of dormancy. Jake watched this display of natural predation with complex emotions. Pride in Shadow's recovery and capability mixed with sadness at the reminder that their relationship was temporary. This was a wild animal reclaiming its birthright, not a pet learning tricks. Shadow's behavior after the kill was equally instructive. It consumed its prey efficiently, leaving nothing edible behind, then approached Jake with what seemed like offering behavior, holding a choice portion of meat in its mouth and dropping it near Jake's feet before retreating a respectful distance. Jake wasn't sure how to interpret this gesture. Was Shadow attempting to share its kill, acknowledging Jake as a pack member? Or was this simply coincidental behavior with no social significance? Either way, Jake felt honored by what seemed like inclusion in the wolf's natural feeding patterns. Their forest expeditions became longer and more adventurous as Shadow's confidence grew. The wolf would range ahead of Jake, investigating interesting scents or sounds, but always circling back to ensure their continued connection. It was learning to be wild while maintaining its unusual relationship with this particular human. Jake began to understand that Shadow wasn't becoming either purely wild or purely domestic. It was creating something new, a hybrid approach to survival that incorporated both its natural instincts and its unique experience with human partnership. The wolf was writing its own rules for how to exist in both worlds. The most significant development came during a routine patrol when Shadow suddenly displayed behavior that Jake had never seen before. The wolf stopped abruptly in the middle of a familiar trail, hackles rising slightly, head turning toward a section of forest that looked identical to every other section they had passed. Shadow stood perfectly still for nearly a full minute, processing information that Jake's senses couldn't detect. Then, without warning, the wolf began moving purposefully in a direction that would take them off Jake's planned route and deeper into wilderness areas he rarely visited. Jake hesitated. Following Shadow meant abandoning his patrol schedule and venturing into terrain he didn't know well. But the wolf's behavior suggested it had detected something important, something that demanded investigation. The decision to trust Shadow's instincts would prove to be the most significant choice of Jake's career as a ranger, though he couldn't have known it at the time. As he followed the young wolf deeper into the Rocky Mountain wilderness, Jake was unknowingly taking the first steps toward a discovery that would change both their lives forever. Shadow moved through the forest with increasing urgency, no longer the casual exploration of their previous hikes, but purposeful travel toward a specific destination. Jake struggled to keep pace, wondering what force was drawing his companion so powerfully toward the unknown depths of the mountains. Jake's decision to extend their forest expeditions into formal wilderness education sessions emerged from watching Shadow's rapid reacquisition of hunting skills. The wolf's successful rabbit kill had demonstrated that basic predatory instincts remained intact despite months of human care, but Jake recognized that a young wolf separated from its pack would lack crucial survival knowledge typically passed down through family groups. The lessons began informally during their daily hikes around the cabin. Jake would pause at locations where animal signs were particularly abundant, game trails, feeding areas, scent marking posts, and wait while Shadow investigated these natural classrooms. The wolf's learning process was remarkably systematic, moving from broad environmental awareness to increasingly sophisticated analysis of specific survival indicators. Track identification came naturally to Shadow, whose nose could detect scent trails hours old that Jake's human senses couldn't even register. But interpreting the age, direction, and behavioral context of those trails required experience that only patient observation could provide. Jake learned to recognize the subtle differences in Shadow's body language that indicated fresh tracks versus old ones, prey animals versus predators, individual creatures versus groups. During these tracking sessions, Jake witnessed the emergence of complex decision-making processes in Shadow's behavior. The wolf would follow a scent trail for several minutes, then suddenly abandon it in favor of a different path. Initially, Jake interpreted this as distraction or puppy-like inconsistency, but careful observation revealed sophisticated priority assessment. Shadow was learning to evaluate the potential value of different hunting opportunities and allocate its energy accordingly. The forest surrounding Jake's cabin provided an ideal natural laboratory for these wilderness education sessions. Deer paths crisscrossed the mountainside, offering opportunities to study herd behavior and feeding patterns. Rabbit warrens in the lower elevations taught lessons about small game hunting techniques. Bird nesting areas demonstrated the seasonal rhythms that determined prey availability throughout the year. Jake found himself learning alongside Shadow, his human analytical abilities complementing the wolf's intuitive understanding of natural systems. Together, they developed increasingly sophisticated interpretations of forest dynamics, understanding how weather patterns affected animal movement, how seasonal changes influenced feeding behaviors, how territorial disputes between predators created opportunities for smaller hunters. Shadow's hunting success rate improved dramatically as these lessons accumulated. The wolf progressed from occasional lucky catches to consistent small game hunting, developing strategies appropriate for different prey species and environmental conditions. Jake watched with fascination as Shadow learned to adjust its approach for rabbits versus squirrels versus ground-dwelling birds, each species requiring different tactical considerations. The relationship between teacher and student became increasingly fluid during these educational expeditions. While Jake provided human perspective on environmental analysis, Shadow's sensory capabilities often revealed information that Jake would never have detected independently. The wolf could sense approaching weather changes, detect the presence of large predators hours before they became visible, and identify subtle variations in terrain stability that prevented them from entering dangerous areas. Jake began to understand that their partnership was evolving into something more sophisticated than simple human caretaking of a recovering animal. Shadow was becoming a wilderness guide whose capabilities complemented and often exceeded Jake's own environmental expertise. The wolf's natural abilities, enhanced by systematic learning opportunities, were creating a formidable survival skill set. The most significant breakthrough came during a tracking session in late April when Shadow demonstrated learned behavior that went far beyond instinctive responses. The wolf had been following a complex scent trail that wound through difficult terrain, requiring careful navigation around fallen trees and steep rock formations. When the trail led to a cliff edge where continuing would be dangerous, Shadow didn't simply abandon the hunt. Instead, the wolf systematically explored alternative routes, eventually discovering a safer path that would allow it to intercept the prey animal's probable destination rather than simply follow its exact route. This demonstrated strategic thinking and environmental problem solving that impressed Jake with its sophistication. Jake realized he was witnessing the development of a hunting intelligence that combined natural predatory instincts with learned environmental analysis. Shadow wasn't just recovering its ability to survive in the wild. It was becoming an exceptionally capable predator whose skills might eventually exceed those of pack-raised wolves. The educational process wasn't entirely one-sided. Shadow's responses to Jake's presence during hunting expeditions taught valuable lessons about human-wolf interaction in natural settings. The wolf maintained awareness of Jake's location and capabilities, occasionally modifying its hunting strategies to account for the human's limitations or using Jake's presence as a tactical advantage in certain situations. These collaborative hunting sessions revealed the potential for genuine partnership between human and wolf intelligence. Jake's analytical abilities and environmental knowledge, combined with Shadow's sensory capabilities and predatory instincts, created problem-solving opportunities that neither could achieve independently. But the success of these wilderness education sessions also forced Jake to confront the central dilemma of their relationship. Every skill Shadow acquired, every successful hunt, every demonstration of increasing independence brought them closer to the inevitable moment when the wolf would no longer need human partnership for survival. Jake found himself experiencing conflicted emotions about Shadow's rapid progress. Pride in the wolf's achievements mixed with anxiety about the approaching separation. Each successful lesson brought Shadow closer to complete self-sufficiency, which was exactly what Jake had hoped to achieve, but also what he increasingly dreaded. The forest expeditions became longer and more ambitious as Shadow's confidence grew. The wolf would range ahead of Jake for extended periods, conducting independent hunts or explorations before circling back to rejoin their shared journey. These solo adventures demonstrated that Shadow was developing the self-reliance necessary for survival without human support. Jake began to recognize signs that Shadow was outgrowing their current arrangement. The wolf's interest in areas beyond their usual patrol routes was increasing, and its responses to distant wolf vocalizations carried emotional undertones that hadn't been present during early recovery. Shadow was remembering its identity as a pack animal, even while maintaining its unusual bond with Jake. The educational phase of their relationship was approaching its natural conclusion. Shadow had acquired the hunting skills, environmental awareness, and strategic thinking abilities necessary for independent survival. The broken wolf pup that Jake had rescued from avalanche debris had become a capable predator ready to reclaim its place in the wild ecosystem. Yet both human and wolf seemed reluctant to acknowledge this transition. Their daily forest lessons continued with mutual enthusiasm, even as the underlying purpose, preparing Shadow for independent survival, neared completion. Jake understood that he was delaying the inevitable separation, but Shadow's continued willingness to participate in their educational partnership suggested that the wolf might be equally reluctant to end their collaboration. The wilderness had become their shared classroom, and both teacher and student had learned far more than either had expected when their unusual partnership began. But the lessons were drawing to a close, and soon they would both need to face the question of what came next in their evolving relationship. As spring advanced towards summer, Jake knew that their time together was becoming precious in ways he hadn't anticipated. Shadow's education was nearly complete, and soon the wolf would need to make choices about its future that might not include continued partnership with humans. The first concrete evidence of other wolves in the area appeared during a routine morning patrol in early May. Jake discovered fresh tracks along a creek bed approximately 2 miles from his cabin, for distinct sets of paw prints indicating a small pack had passed through the area within the previous 12 hours. The tracks were larger than Shadow's, suggesting fully mature adults, and the spacing and gait patterns indicated confident, territorial movement rather than casual passage. Shadow's reaction to the discovery was immediate and intense. The young wolf froze the moment it encountered the scent trail, hackles rising slightly as it processed information that Jake's human senses couldn't detect. Shadow's nostrils flared as it worked to decode the complex chemical messages left by the passing pack, and Jake could see tension building in the wolf's entire body. For nearly 10 minutes, Shadow remained motionless beside the tracks, head raised to test the wind for any current scent traces. The wolf's golden eyes held an expression Jake had never seen before, a mixture of excitement, longing, and something that might have been recognition. When a distant howl echoed across the valley, Shadow's response was instantaneous and heartbreaking. The young wolf tilted its head back and released a long, mournful call that seemed to carry months of isolation and desperate hope. The sound was unlike any vocalization Shadow had made during its recovery, deeper and more complex than the whimpers and growls Jake had grown accustomed to. This was wolf language, a communication attempt directed toward creatures who might actually understand and respond. The howl was answered almost immediately by multiple voices from different locations around the valley, indicating that the pack was still in the area and had heard Shadow's call. Jake watched Shadow's reaction to these responses with growing concern. The wolf's entire body trembled with emotion, caught between the desire to abandon everything and race toward those distant voices and uncertainty about how such a reunion might unfold. Jake understood immediately that their relationship had entered its final phase. Shadow's connection to its own kind was reasserting itself with undeniable power, and no amount of human companionship could compete with the biological imperative to rejoin a wolf pack. The months of careful rehabilitation and growing partnership were being overshadowed by instincts millions of years in the making. The next several days brought a fundamental change in Shadow's behavior patterns. The wolf remained with Jake during their daily activities, but its attention was increasingly focused on the surrounding forest rather than on their shared routines. Shadow would pause frequently during their hikes, testing the air for scent traces or listening intently for vocal communications that might indicate pack movement in the area. Sleep became elusive for Shadow, whose nights were now filled with restless pacing and periodic trips to the cabin door to listen for sounds from the darkness outside. Jake would wake to find the wolf standing motionless near the windows, staring out at the forest with an intensity that spoke to profound inner conflict. The pack's presence in the area wasn't constant. Their scent trails would disappear for days at a time, only to reappear in different locations as the group moved through their territory according to seasonal hunting patterns. But even when no fresh sign could be detected, Shadow remained in a state of heightened alertness, as if expecting at any moment to hear the calls that would summon it back to its natural family. Jake found himself studying Shadow's responses to these pack indicators with the analytical detachment of a wildlife biologist, even as his personal emotions struggled with the implications. The wolf's behavioral changes were textbook examples of social animal response to pack proximity. The restlessness, the vocal communication attempts, the decreased interest in individual activities in favor of group-seeking behaviors. Most significantly, Shadow's relationship with Jake began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. The wolf remained cooperative and responsive during their interactions, but Jake could sense a growing emotional distance. Shadow seemed to be gradually withdrawing its investment in their partnership, preparing psychologically for a different kind of social arrangement. The change was most apparent during feeding times. Shadow had always maintained some independence around food, but now it showed increasing reluctance to accept meals prepared by Jake. The wolf would often wait until Jake was absent before eating, as if accepting human-provided food had become somehow inappropriate given its renewed awareness of pack presence. Jake's own emotional response to these developments surprised him with its intensity. He had always known that Shadow would eventually return to the wild, had planned for that outcome from the beginning, but the reality of impending separation created feelings he hadn't anticipated. The wolf had become far more than a rehabilitation project. It had become a companion whose presence had enriched Jake's solitary existence in ways he was only beginning to understand. The practical implications were equally challenging. If Shadow left to rejoin the pack, Jake would return to his previous routine of solitary patrols and empty evenings at the cabin. The wilderness education sessions that had become such an important part of his daily life would end, along with the unique partnership that had made him feel more connected to the natural world than ever before in his career. But Jake's concerns went beyond personal loss. Shadow was still a young wolf, lacking the full physical development and social experience of pack-born animals. Would the approaching pack accept a wolf that had spent months living with humans? Could Shadow successfully integrate into pack hierarchy and hunting strategies after its extended absence from wolf society? These questions took on new urgency when Jake discovered evidence that the pack was not just passing through the area, but had actually established a temporary territorial presence. Fresh scent markings appeared regularly along established patrol routes, indicating that the pack was actively claiming and defending this section of forest. The pack's territorial behavior suggested they might be preparing for den season, when wolves establish secure locations for raising young. If this was the case, their presence in the area could extend for several months, creating an extended period of tension and uncertainty about Shadow's future. Jake began observing Shadow's responses to different types of pack communication, hoping to understand what messages were being exchanged. The wolf's reactions varied significantly depending on the time of day, weather conditions, and apparent distance of the calling animals. Some howls prompted immediate vocal responses from Shadow, while others seemed to create anxiety rather than excitement. The complexity of these communications reminded Jake of how little he really understood about wolf social dynamics. Shadow was participating in conversations whose meaning and significance were completely opaque to human interpretation. The wolf was receiving and processing information that might be determining its future, and Jake could only watch from the outside. As May progressed towards summer, Jake realized that his role in Shadow's life was transitioning from active caretaker to passive observer. The wolf's decisions about pack integration would be made according to instincts and social protocols that humans could witness but never truly comprehend. The approaching separation felt inevitable now, though its exact timing and circumstances remained uncertain. Shadow was being called back to its natural world, and Jake would soon need to find the strength to let his remarkable companion answer that call, regardless of his personal feelings about their partnership ending. The forest around them had become a stage for ancient dramas of pack loyalty and social belonging that would ultimately determine whether Jake's months of careful rehabilitation had prepared Shadow for successful return to the wild, or whether the wolf's unusual upbringing had made such integration impossible. Jake's first attempt to facilitate Shadow's return to the wild came on a cool morning in mid-May, when fresh pack sign indicated the wolves had spent the night less than half a mile from the cabin. The proximity felt like an opportunity that might not come again soon, and Jake made the painful decision to help Shadow take the final step toward independence. He prepared carefully for what he hoped would be Shadow's successful reunion with its own kind. Jake packed a day's worth of supplies and led Shadow toward the area where the pack scent was strongest, intending to bring the young wolf as close as safely possible before withdrawing and allowing nature to take its course. The hike to the rendezvous location took nearly 2 hours through increasingly wild terrain. Shadow's behavior grew more animated with each step, the wolf's excitement building as pack scent grew stronger and more recent. By the time they reached a small clearing where multiple scent trails converged, Shadow was vibrating with barely contained energy. Jake studied the area carefully, looking for the best approach to what he hoped would be Shadow's reintegration. The pack had clearly used this clearing as a meeting point, with scent markings and disturbed ground indicating recent social activity. If Shadow was going to rejoin its family, this seemed like the ideal location for such a reunion. The moment of separation arrived sooner than Jake expected. Shadow suddenly froze at the edge of the clearing, head raised and ears forward, obviously detecting pack presence that Jake's human senses couldn't register. The wolf looked back at Jake once, golden eyes holding an expression that seemed almost like gratitude, then began moving purposefully toward whatever it had sensed in the forest beyond. Jake watched Shadow disappear into the trees with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. This was exactly the outcome he had worked toward for months. The successful rehabilitation of a wild animal that could now reclaim its natural place in the ecosystem. Shadow was strong, capable, and ready for the challenges of pack life. For the next 3 hours, Jake remained in the area, listening for sounds that might indicate successful pack reunion. Occasionally, he heard distant vocalizations that could have been wolf communications, but nothing definitive enough to confirm that Shadow had found its family. As afternoon shadows began lengthening, Jake made the difficult decision to return to his cabin alone. The hike back felt longer than any wilderness trek Jake had ever undertaken. Every few hundred yards, he found himself pausing to listen for sounds of Shadow's return, hoping to hear the familiar padding of paws catching up from behind. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the absence of his unusual companion had drained something vital from the landscape. Jake reached his cabin as evening was settling over the mountains, and the emptiness hit him immediately. The space that had been shared for so many months now felt hollow and oversized. Shadow's favorite sleeping spot near the stove looked abandoned. The food bowls seemed pointless, and the silence was oppressive in ways Jake hadn't experienced since before the avalanche. Sleep proved impossible that first night alone. Jake found himself getting up repeatedly to check outside for any sign of Shadow's return, knowing such hope was unrealistic but unable to suppress it entirely. Each sound from the forest, wind through trees, settling snow, distant animal calls, triggered momentary optimism followed by disappointment. The second day brought no sign of Shadow, which Jake interpreted as positive evidence of successful pack integration. If the reunion had failed, the wolf would likely have returned to the security of the cabin and human companionship. Shadow's continued absence suggested it had found acceptance among its own kind and was beginning the process of rebuilding pack relationships. Jake attempted to return to his normal ranger routines, but everything felt different without Shadow's presence. Patrol routes that had become collaborative explorations now felt like solitary obligations. The forest itself seemed less interesting when experienced alone, lacking the enhanced sensory awareness that Shadow's presence had provided. By the third day, Jake's rational confidence in Shadow's successful integration was being undermined by growing emotional anxiety. The forest around the cabin showed no sign of recent wolf activity, suggesting that the pack had moved on to different territory. If Shadow was with them, it meant their partnership was truly ended. But if something had gone wrong with the integration attempt, Shadow might be alone in the wilderness without the safety net of human support. The return came at dawn on the fourth day, announced by familiar scratching sounds at the cabin door. Jake rushed outside to find Shadow sitting on the porch, looking tired and somewhat disheveled, but otherwise healthy. The wolf's golden eyes held an expression Jake had never seen before, something that might have been confusion or disappointment. Shadow's behavior upon return was markedly different from its pre-separation patterns. The wolf seemed subdued and uncertain, lacking the confident energy that had characterized its recent weeks. It accepted food gratefully but without enthusiasm, and spent long periods lying motionless near the stove as if emotionally exhausted. Jake's relief at Shadow's return was tempered by concern about what the failed integration attempt might mean for the wolf's psychological well-being. Had Shadow been rejected by the pack? Had it chosen to return to human companionship over wild pack life? Or had the reunion simply not developed in ways that met Shadow's social needs? The wolf's behavior over the following days suggested complex emotional processing of the separation experience. Shadow would periodically approach the cabin door and stare out at the forest with what appeared to be longing. But when Jake opened the door to offer outdoor time, the wolf showed little interest in extended exploration. Most significantly, Shadow began displaying attachment behaviors that hadn't been present before the separation attempt. The wolf would follow Jake around the cabin more closely than ever before, seeming reluctant to let the human out of sight for extended periods. When Jake prepared to leave for patrol duties, Shadow would show obvious distress, pacing and whining in ways that suggested anxiety about another abandonment. Jake realized that his attempt to facilitate Shadow's return to pack life had actually strengthened their bond rather than ending it. The wolf had experienced the alternative to human partnership and had chosen to return, suggesting a level of commitment to their relationship that went beyond simple convenience or dependency. This development forced Jake to reconsider his assumptions about Shadow's needs and desires. Perhaps the wolf's connection to human companionship was stronger than biological imperatives toward pack integration. Maybe Shadow's months of recovery had created social bonds that couldn't be easily replaced by traditional wolf relationships. The practical implications were significant. If Shadow had actively chosen human partnership over pack life, Jake needed to develop long-term plans that accommodated a permanent wild wolf companion. This would require adjustments to his living situation, work responsibilities, and future planning that he hadn't previously considered necessary. But Jake also worried about the psychological health of a wolf that might be choosing human companionship because pack integration had failed rather than because it represented a genuinely preferred alternative. Shadow's subdued behavior suggested the separation experience had been traumatic in ways that might take time to fully understand. The failed integration attempt had clarified the depth of their unusual partnership, but it had also raised new questions about what kind of future might be possible for a wolf that seemed to exist between two worlds without fully belonging to either. Shadow had chosen to return, but whether that choice represented healthy preference or adaptive compromise remained unclear. As they settled back into shared routines, both human and wolf seemed to understand that their relationship had entered new territory. The separation had tested bonds that proved stronger than either had fully realized, but it had also demonstrated that their partnership existed outside normal patterns of human-animal relationships. Whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by experiences and choices that had created something unique in both their lives. 3 weeks after Shadow's return from the failed pack integration, the wolf began exhibiting behavior that was entirely unprecedented in their months together. It started subtly during their regular morning patrols, when Shadow would pause at seemingly random locations and stare intently into the forest depths, as if seeing or sensing something that demanded investigation. These episodes initially lasted only a few seconds, brief moments of distraction that Jake attributed to the wolf's ongoing psychological adjustment after the traumatic separation experience. But gradually, the pauses became longer and more frequent, with Shadow displaying increasing agitation during these mysterious focus sessions. The behavior escalated dramatically during a routine hike along familiar trails near the cabin. Shadow suddenly stopped dead in the middle of a well-worn path, hackles rising slightly as it oriented toward a section of dense pine forest that Jake had traversed countless times without incident. The wolf stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, processing information that Jake's human senses couldn't detect. When Shadow finally moved, it wasn't to continue along their planned route. Instead, the wolf turned 90 degrees and began walking purposefully toward the forest interior, moving with the kind of determined focus that Jake had learned indicated serious intent rather than casual exploration. Jake's attempts to redirect Shadow back to their original path were completely ignored. The wolf acknowledged his calls with brief glances, but continued moving steadily toward whatever had captured its attention. For the first time since their partnership began, Shadow was asserting complete independence from Jake's guidance, following imperatives that superseded human direction. The terrain Shadow chose was challenging even by mountain wilderness standards. Dense undergrowth made passage difficult, and the steep slopes required careful navigation to avoid dangerous footing. Jake found himself struggling to keep pace as Shadow moved through this obstacle course with surprising confidence, as if following a route it had traveled many times before. Most unsettling was Shadow's apparent familiarity with landscape that Jake knew the wolf had never experienced. Shadow would change direction at seemingly arbitrary points, yet these course corrections consistently led them around impassable barriers or dangerous terrain features. The wolf was navigating by some internal compass that operated independently of visual landmarks. Jake began to suspect that Shadow's strange behavior was connected to inherited genetic memory, the kind of ancestral knowledge that guided migratory animals across vast distances they had never personally traveled. Perhaps months of living with humans had suppressed these deep instincts, and the failed pack integration had somehow awakened dormant navigational programming. The possibility was both fascinating and concerning. If Shadow was responding to genetic imperatives, Jake had no way to predict where this journey might lead or how long it might continue. The wolf could be following ancient migration routes that extended hundreds of miles beyond familiar territory, into wilderness areas where human rescue would be impossible if problems developed. Despite these concerns, Jake found himself committed to following wherever Shadow might lead. The wolf's behavior was too purposeful to be dismissed as random wandering, and Jake's curiosity about the destination was becoming as strong as his worry about the journey. Shadow was clearly being drawn towards something specific, and Jake wanted to understand what force could command such unwavering determination. Their progress through the difficult terrain was necessarily slow, requiring frequent rest stops and careful route finding around major obstacles. Shadow showed patience with these delays, but never wavered from its chosen direction. The wolf would wait for Jake to catch up, then immediately resume its purposeful advance toward the unknown destination. By late afternoon, they had traveled farther from the cabin than any of their previous expeditions, entering sections of the Rocky Mountain wilderness that Jake had never personally explored. The forest here felt older and wilder, with massive trees and untouched undergrowth that spoke to minimal human impact over generations. Shadow's behavior grew increasingly animated as they penetrated deeper into this pristine environment. The wolf's pace quickened despite the difficult terrain, and its entire demeanor suggested growing excitement about their approach to whatever goal was driving this expedition. Jake began noticing environmental changes that might explain Shadow's unusual confidence in this unfamiliar territory. Game trails were more numerous and better defined than in areas closer to human habitation. Scent markings from various animal species were abundant, indicating rich wildlife populations. The forest ecosystem here was clearly more intact and vibrant than the partially managed wilderness around Jake's ranger station. Most significantly, Jake detected signs of wolf presence that were older and more extensive than the recent pack activity near his cabin. Scent markings, scat, and territorial indicators suggested that wolves had been using this area regularly for extended periods, possibly including previous generations of packs. The realization struck Jake that Shadow might be leading him toward traditional wolf territory, places where its species had established long-term presence and cultural significance. If this was the case, the wolf's apparent familiarity with the route could represent inherited knowledge about ancestral homelands passed down through genetic or social memory. As evening approached, Jake faced a decision about whether to continue following Shadow into increasingly remote wilderness or attempt to turn back toward familiar territory before darkness made travel dangerous. The wolf showed no signs of fatigue or uncertainty, suggesting it expected to reach its destination soon. But Jake's human limitations were becoming a factor in their continued progress. Shadow resolved the dilemma by suddenly increasing its pace and displaying unmistakable excitement, behavior that suggested their journey's end was imminent. The wolf began moving with barely contained energy, periodically looking back at Jake as if urging greater speed toward whatever awaited them in the deepening forest. Jake committed to following Shadow's lead despite his growing concerns about their distance from safety and familiar territory. The wolf's behavior was too compelling to abandon now, and Jake's professional curiosity about Shadow's destination had become stronger than his practical worries about the risks they were accepting. The forest around them was changing character as they climbed higher into mountain elevations where human influence became negligible. Ancient trees stretched overhead in cathedral-like formations, their massive trunks and interlocking canopy creating an environment that felt untouched by modern civilization. Shadow's excitement continued building as they navigated through this primeval landscape, the wolf's obvious anticipation suggesting that whatever had drawn them so far from familiar territory was finally within reach. Jake prepared himself for a revelation that might explain not just Shadow's strange behavior, but perhaps something fundamental about the relationship between wolves and the wilderness that had shaped both their species for countless generations. The mystery that had begun with subtle behavioral changes was approaching resolution in this ancient forest, and Jake sensed that whatever they discovered would profoundly change his understanding of both Shadow and the wild places they had learned to share. Jake's decision to fully commit to Shadow's mysterious journey came at the moment when rational caution should have demanded retreat. They had traveled nearly 8 miles from the cabin through increasingly challenging terrain. Darkness was approaching, and Jake's emergency supplies were limited to what he carried for routine day patrols. Yet Shadow's unwavering determination and obvious excitement made abandoning the expedition feel impossible. The final phase of their journey took them along what Jake gradually recognized as an ancient game trail, worn smooth by generations of animal passage. The path was so old and well-established that it felt more like a natural feature than something created by wildlife movement, winding through the forest with efficient curves that minimized elevation changes while maintaining steady progress toward higher elevations. Shadow's familiarity with this route became undeniable as they climbed. The wolf would anticipate trail junctions and direction changes before they became visible, taking correct paths through terrain it had supposedly never experienced. Jake's amazement at this navigation ability was tempered by growing concern about how far Shadow intended to lead them into unknown wilderness. The forest environment continued evolving as they gained altitude, transitioning from mixed deciduous and coniferous growth to predominantly evergreen stands dominated by massive ancient pines and spruces. The understory grew sparser, creating cathedral-like spaces between the enormous tree trunks where sound carried differently and shadows took on mysterious depth. Jake began noticing signs of significant wildlife activity that suggested they were approaching an area of particular ecological importance. Game trails converged from multiple directions, creating a network of paths that indicated this region served as a natural highway for animal movement through the mountains. Scent markings were abundant and varied, representing multiple species and suggesting rich biodiversity. Most intriguingly, Jake observed evidence of wolf presence that was both more extensive and older than anything he had encountered in his years of wilderness patrol. Territorial markings, denning sites, and hunting areas indicated that wolves had been using this region continuously for what might be decades or longer. The signs suggested not just occasional pack passage, but established long-term territorial presence. As evening shadows deepened, Shadow's behavior shifted from determined travel to obvious anticipation. The wolf's pace quickened despite the steep terrain. It began displaying the kind of excited energy that Jake had learned indicated imminent arrival at a significant destination. Shadow would pause frequently to test the air, tail held high in alert attention, then surge forward with renewed urgency. The breakthrough came as they crested a small ridge and Shadow suddenly stopped, entire body rigid with attention focused on something beyond Jake's immediate perception. The wolf stood motionless for nearly a full minute, processing information that clearly held enormous significance, then looked back at Jake with an expression that seemed almost like invitation. Jake moved carefully to Shadow's position and found himself looking down into a hidden valley that took his breath away. The geological formation was a natural amphitheater carved by ancient glacial action, creating a protected depression several miles across, surrounded by steep walls that would make casual human access nearly impossible. The valley floor was carpeted with pristine meadowland interspersed with groves of massive old-growth trees. Even in the failing light, Jake could see that this was wilderness as it had existed before human influence. No cut stumps, no trail markers, no signs of modern intrusion marred the landscape. Water glinted silver in the valley bottom, suggesting springs or streams that would support rich wildlife populations year-round. Shadow's reaction to seeing the valley was immediate and profound. The wolf released a long, complex howl that seemed to combine greeting, announcement, and celebration. The sound echoed off the surrounding cliffs with haunting beauty, then was answered by multiple voices from the valley depths. But these responses were different from the pack communications Jake had heard near his cabin. Richer, more varied, suggesting a larger and more complex wolf community. As the answering calls continued, Jake realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. The vocal exchanges between Shadow and the valley wolves carried emotional undertones that spoke to recognition and welcome rather than territorial challenge. Shadow wasn't approaching strangers. It was coming home to family that had been waiting for its return. The descent into the valley required careful navigation down steep, rocky slopes that would have been treacherous in full darkness. Shadow moved confidently ahead, clearly familiar with safe routes despite supposedly never having been in this location before. Jake followed carefully, using his flashlight sparingly to avoid disturbing whatever reunion was about to unfold. The valley floor proved even more remarkable than it had appeared from above. Ancient meadows stretched between groves of trees, so massive they seemed to belong to an earlier geological age. Springs bubbled from multiple locations, creating a network of crystal-clear streams that supported lush vegetation and abundant wildlife signs. Jake's professional assessment of the valley's ecological significance was interrupted by Shadow's increasingly excited behavior. The wolf was nearly vibrating with anticipation, responding to scents and sounds that indicated the proximity of other wolves. When shapes began emerging from the tree line ahead, Jake realized he was about to witness a reunion that would answer many of the questions that had puzzled him about Shadow's origins and behavior. The approaching wolves were magnificent specimens, larger and more robust than Shadow, with the confident bearing of animals that had never known human interference. Their approach was cautious but not hostile, suggesting they recognized Shadow despite its extended absence and altered scent from months of human contact. Jake remained perfectly still as Shadow advanced to meet what were clearly family members. The reunion was conducted according to wolf protocols that Jake could observe but not fully understand. Complex scent exchanges, body language communications, and vocalizations that conveyed information about Shadow's experiences and current status. Most remarkably, the adult wolves showed no aggression toward Jake despite his obvious human presence. They acknowledged him with cautious attention, but seemed to understand that he was connected to Shadow's survival and return. Jake realized he was being evaluated according to wolf social protocols that determined his status within their community context. As the initial reunion concluded, Jake began to understand the true significance of Shadow's mysterious journey. The wolf hadn't been following random genetic impulses or responding to territorial instincts. It had been returning to its birthplace, leading Jake to a hidden sanctuary where its family had waited through the months of separation, hoping for exactly this kind of homecoming. The valley represented something far more important than just wolf habitat. It was a preserved ecosystem where ancient relationships between predators, prey, and environment continued according to patterns established long before human civilization began altering natural systems. Jake's presence in this sacred place felt both privileged and overwhelming. He had been granted access to wilderness secrets that few humans would ever witness, brought here by a wolf whose trust had bridged the gap between two very different worlds. As night settled over the hidden valley, Jake prepared to spend his first evening in a place where wolves still lived according to their own ancient laws. With a partnership between human and wolf that had begun with an avalanche rescue, was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The morning after their arrival in the hidden valley revealed the true scope of what Shadow had led Jake to discover. As dawn light filtered through the ancient trees, Jake could see that this wasn't simply a remote wilderness area, but a complete ecosystem that had remained virtually untouched by human influence for generations. The wolf pack that had welcomed Shadow consisted of 7 adults and 3 juveniles from the previous year's litter, a family group large enough to maintain genetic diversity while remaining small enough to sustain themselves on the valley's resources. Jake watched their morning routines with fascination, observing social behaviors and hunting strategies that represented pure wolf culture unmarked by human interference. Shadow's integration into pack activities was seamless in ways that surprised Jake. Despite months away and extended human contact, the young wolf slipped effortlessly back into family dynamics, taking its place in the social hierarchy as if the separation had been temporary rather than life-altering. The pack's acceptance suggested that Shadow's essential wolf nature had remained intact despite its unusual experiences. Jake found himself assigned an unofficial role as observer, tolerated by the pack, but clearly understood to be outside their social structure. The adult wolves maintained respectful distance while going about their daily activities, occasionally glancing in his direction, but showing no hostility or fear. Their behavior suggested they had made collective decisions about his presence that allowed for peaceful coexistence. The valley's geography became clearer as Jake explored under pack supervision. The natural amphitheater was larger than his initial assessment had suggested, extending nearly 5 miles in diameter with numerous side canyons and hidden meadows that provided diverse habitat zones. Elevation changes within the valley created microclimates that supported different plant communities and wildlife species. Most significantly, Jake discovered evidence of the valley's historical importance to wolf populations. Ancient denning sites carved into cliff faces showed generations of use, with some excavations clearly decades old. Scent-marking territories throughout the valley indicated complex social arrangements that had been maintained over extended periods. The pack's daily hunting routines revealed sophisticated strategies adapted specifically to the valley's unique environment. Different family members specialized in hunting particular prey species, with coordinated efforts that maximized success while minimizing energy expenditure. Jake watched elk hunts that demonstrated tactical planning and execution that would have impressed military strategists. Shadow participated in these hunting expeditions with enthusiasm that revealed how much it had missed pack cooperation during its months of human-dependent recovery. The young wolf's skills had developed impressively during its wilderness education sessions with Jake, but applying those abilities within pack coordination represented an entirely different level of predatory capability. Jake's presence during these hunts was tolerated but carefully managed by the pack. He was positioned where he could observe without interfering, suggesting the wolves understood his scientific interest while ensuring he didn't compromise their hunting success. Their accommodation of his curiosity indicated remarkable intelligence and adaptability. The valley's water sources proved to be its most remarkable feature. Multiple springs emerged from underground aquifers, creating a network of streams that never froze completely even during harsh mountain winters. These water sources supported plant communities and wildlife populations that would have been impossible in more typical alpine environments. Jake's botanical surveys revealed plant species that were uncommon or rare in surrounding wilderness areas, including several varieties he couldn't immediately identify. The valley's protected microclimate had apparently preserved genetic diversity that had been lost elsewhere due to climate fluctuations and human impact. Wildlife observation confirmed that the valley supported prey populations adequate to sustain the wolf pack year-round. Elk, deer, and smaller game animals thrived in numbers that suggested minimal hunting pressure from sources other than natural predation. The ecosystem had achieved the kind of balanced predator-prey relationships that were increasingly rare in managed wilderness areas. Most intriguingly, Jake found evidence of other large predators that used the valley seasonally. Bear sign indicated both black bears and grizzlies visited regularly, though apparently not in direct competition with the wolf pack. Mountain lion tracks suggested these solitary hunters also found the valley's prey concentrations attractive during certain times of year. The complex relationships between these various predator species fascinated Jake from a professional standpoint. The valley appeared to support multiple top-level carnivores through some combination of abundant prey, territorial time-sharing, and ecological niche specialization that prevented destructive competition. Shadow's role in pack hunting became clearer as Jake observed multiple expeditions. The young wolf's human-influenced experiences had actually enhanced its value to the pack, providing perspectives on prey behavior and environmental analysis that complemented traditional wolf knowledge. Shadow had become a more effective hunter through its unusual education. The pack's acceptance of Shadow despite its altered scent and behavior patterns impressed Jake with its implications for wolf social flexibility. These animals had evaluated Shadow's essential wolf nature rather than judging it based on superficial changes, demonstrating psychological sophistication that challenged common assumptions about animal intelligence. Jake began documenting his observations systematically, recognizing that he might be witnessing wildlife behaviors and ecosystem relationships that had never been scientifically recorded. The valley represented a natural laboratory where predator-prey dynamics, pack social structures, and wilderness ecosystem functions could be studied without human interference variables. The logistical challenges of extended observation became apparent as Jake's limited supplies dwindled. He had carried emergency rations for a single day's patrol, not an extended research expedition. The pack seemed to understand his limitations, with individual wolves occasionally bringing him portions of their kills, suggesting they had made decisions about his welfare that went beyond simple tolerance. These feeding offerings created complex emotions for Jake. Accepting food from wild predators felt both humbling and profound, representing a level of interspecies cooperation that few humans had ever experienced. Yet he also understood that such dependency could not continue indefinitely without compromising both his safety and the pack's natural behaviors. As his first week in the valley concluded, Jake faced decisions about how long he could remain in this extraordinary place and what responsibilities his unique access created. The scientific value of continued observation was enormous, but his presence inevitably influenced behaviors he was trying to study. Shadow seemed to understand Jake's dilemma, spending time with both pack family and human companion, as if trying to bridge two worlds that had shaped its remarkable life. The young wolf had brought Jake to a place of profound natural significance, but the next steps in their relationship remained unclear. The Hidden Valley had revealed secrets about wolf society and wilderness ecosystem function that would take years to fully understand, but Jake's immediate concerns focused on how long he could remain as an observer without becoming a disruptive influence on the very phenomena he hoped to study. Jake's second week in the Hidden Valley brought encounters with wildlife that transformed his understanding of Rocky Mountain ecosystem dynamics. The morning began routinely with the pack's coordinated hunting activities, but as Jake followed at his assigned observational distance, he witnessed interactions between predator species that challenged conventional wildlife management assumptions. A massive grizzly bear emerged from a grove of ancient spruces just as the wolf pack was approaching a small herd of elk. Rather than the territorial confrontation Jake expected, both predator groups engaged in what appeared to be ritualized acknowledgement behaviors. The wolves altered their hunting approach to avoid direct competition, while the bear continued its own foraging activities in parallel territory. Jake watched this sophisticated conflict avoidance with professional fascination. These animals had developed protocols for sharing rich hunting grounds that minimized dangerous confrontations, while allowing multiple predator species to exploit the valley's abundant prey populations. The arrangement suggested generations of evolutionary adaptation to this unique environment. Shadow's reaction to the grizzly encounter revealed another layer of the young wolf's remarkable adaptability. Rather than showing the fear or aggression that might be expected from a wolf confronting such a formidable competitor, Shadow displayed calm assessment and strategic positioning that indicated inherited knowledge about bear-wolf interactions in this specific environment. The bear itself was an impressive specimen, easily weighing over 400 pounds with the confident bearing of an animal that had never experienced human hunting pressure. Its coat was rich chocolate brown with silver highlights that suggested advanced age and extensive experience. When it briefly made eye contact with Jake across the meadow, the intelligence in those small dark eyes was unmistakable. Following the successful hunt, Jake observed food-sharing behaviors among the pack that demonstrated social complexity beyond his previous understanding of wolf dynamics. The distribution of meat followed protocols that seemed to account for individual contributions to the hunt's success, physical condition of pack members, and social status within the hierarchy. Most remarkably, Shadow participated in these sharing decisions despite its recent return to the pack. The young wolf's opinions about meat distribution appeared to carry weight with the adults, suggesting that its months of human contact had enhanced rather than diminished its standing within wolf society. The afternoon brought Jake's first encounter with the valley's mountain lion population. A sleek female cougar appeared on a rocky outcrop overlooking the pack's feeding area, watching the wolves with the patient attention of a predator evaluating opportunities. Her presence created tension among the wolves, but not the explosive hostility Jake might have expected. Instead, the pack responded with coordinated vigilance that allowed them to continue feeding while maintaining defensive positioning against potential cougar attack. Shadow positioned itself strategically between the cat and the pack's youngest members, demonstrating protective instincts that had clearly been strengthened by its experiences with vulnerability and recovery. The cougar's behavior was equally sophisticated, maintaining visual contact with the wolves while clearly communicating non-aggressive intent through body language and positioning. After nearly an hour of this standoff, the big cat simply melted back into the rocky terrain, leaving Jake with the impression that he had witnessed a complex negotiation between competing predators. These multi-species interactions continued throughout Jake's extended observation period, revealing a predator community that had evolved intricate protocols for coexistence within the valley's rich but limited ecosystem. Each species had apparently developed specialized hunting strategies and territorial arrangements that minimized direct competition while maximizing resource utilization. Jake began documenting behavioral patterns that contradicted much of what he had learned about predator relationships during his ranger training. The valley's isolated ecosystem had created unique evolutionary pressures that favored cooperation and conflict avoidance over the aggressive territorial behaviors more common in areas where prey was scarce and human interference disrupted natural patterns. The implications for wildlife management policy were staggering. If large predator species could coexist successfully in properly balanced ecosystems, many of the assumptions underlying current conservation strategies might need fundamental revision. The valley represented a natural experiment in predator-prey dynamics that had been running uninterrupted for decades or possibly centuries. Shadow's integration into this complex ecosystem impressed Jake with its seamless efficiency. The young wolf seemed to understand instinctively the behavioral protocols that maintained peace between competing predator species, suggesting that such knowledge was encoded genetically rather than learned through extended experience. Jake's presence as an observer was creating its own interesting dynamics within the valley's social structure. The various predator species had apparently reached consensus about his status as a non-threatening neutral party, allowing him unprecedented access to behaviors that would normally be hidden from human observation. The wolves began including Jake in their territorial patrols, positioning him where he could observe their scent-marking behaviors and boundary maintenance activities. These expeditions revealed that the pack's territory was both larger and more precisely defined than Jake had initially realized, with complex arrangements for seasonal sharing with other predator species. During one particularly memorable patrol, Jake observed a direct encounter between Shadow and a young mountain lion that demonstrated the sophisticated communication abilities of both species. The two predators engaged in what appeared to be a ritualized sizing-up process, evaluating each other's capabilities and intentions through carefully controlled displays of strength and agility. The encounter concluded with both animals apparently satisfied about each other's status within the valley's predator hierarchy. Shadow returned to the pack while the cougar disappeared into rocky terrain, and Jake realized he had witnessed a form of interspecies diplomacy that established boundaries and reduced future conflict potential. These observations were revolutionizing Jake's understanding of wilderness ecosystem function. The valley's predator community was far more sophisticated and cooperative than anything described in wildlife management literature. The animals had developed social arrangements that maximized survival for all species through complexity rather than simple competitive dominance. Jake's documentation efforts were constrained by his limited supplies and the challenge of recording observations without disrupting the behaviors he was studying. He began creating detailed mental notes about pack dynamics, predator interactions, and ecosystem relationships that would require months of analysis to fully understand. Most significantly, Jake was beginning to recognize that Shadow had led him to something far more important than a simple wolfpack reunion. The Hidden Valley represented a functioning model of predator-prey relationships as they had existed before human interference began altering natural systems throughout North America. The scientific value of continued observation was enormous, but Jake's resources for extended wilderness survival were reaching critical limits. His emergency food supplies were nearly exhausted, and his absence from normal ranger duties would soon trigger search and rescue operations that could compromise the valley's isolation. Shadow seemed to sense Jake's growing concern about practical limitations. The wolf spent increasing time near Jake during rest periods, as if trying to provide comfort or reassurance about challenges that lay ahead. Their bond had deepened during their time in the valley, but external pressures were creating new dilemmas about their shared future. The hidden valley had revealed natural secrets that could transform understanding of wilderness management and predator conservation. But Jake's ability to continue studying these phenomena was limited by human constraints that the valley's remarkable wildlife community didn't share. As his second week in this extraordinary place drew to a close, Jake faced difficult decisions about how to balance scientific opportunity with practical necessity, and what responsibilities his unique access to these natural treasures might create for his future as both ranger and researcher. The crisis that would test both Jake and Shadow's survival abilities struck without warning during their third week in the Hidden Valley. What had begun as a typical June morning with clear skies and mild temperatures transformed within hours into a violent mountain storm system that trapped them far from any shelter adequate for human survival. The weather change began subtly with high cirrus clouds that gradually thickened into an overcast layer. Jake noticed the barometric pressure dropping as wildlife behavior shifted throughout the valley. Birds moved to protected roosts, small mammals sought burrows, and even a normally active wolf pack showed signs of restlessness that indicated approaching severe weather. Shadow's behavior became particularly agitated as the storm system approached. The young wolf paced constantly and whined in ways that suggested anxiety about more than simple weather discomfort. Jake realized that Shadow was responding to atmospheric pressure changes and other environmental cues that preceded dangerous mountain storms. The first snow began falling around noon. Light flakes that might have been pleasant under normal circumstances, but carried ominous implications for their current situation. Jake's clothing and equipment were appropriate for day, hiking rather than extended exposure to severe weather, and his emergency supplies included no provisions for winter storm survival. Within 2 hours, the light snow had intensified into a blizzard with winds exceeding 40 miles per hour and visibility reduced to less than 50 feet. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in 30 minutes, creating conditions that would be challenging even for properly equipped mountaineers. Jake's immediate concern was finding adequate shelter before hypothermia became a life-threatening factor. The valley's open meadows provided no protection from wind and driving snow, while the scattered tree groves offered only minimal improvement over complete exposure. Shadow seemed to understand the gravity of their situation and began displaying behaviors that suggested the wolf had specific knowledge about weather survival in this environment. The animal abandoned its normal pack activities and focused entirely on Jake, positioning itself close enough to provide body warmth while constantly testing the air for scent traces that might indicate better shelter options. The pack's response to the crisis impressed Jake with its coordinated efficiency. Within minutes of the storm's intensification, the adult wolves had organized their group for survival mode, moving toward terrain features that would provide maximum protection. They included Shadow in their movements, but clearly understood that Jake's human limitations required different considerations. Shadow's loyalty during this critical period was both touching and potentially life-saving. Rather than simply following the pack to optimal wolf shelter, the young wolf remained with Jake and began leading him toward what appeared to be a rocky outcrop that might offer some protection from the worst wind and snow. The trek to Shadow's chosen shelter location required careful navigation through terrain that had become treacherous with accumulating snow and reduced visibility. Jake found himself dependent on Shadow's superior senses and environmental knowledge, following the wolf's lead through landscape he could barely see. The shelter Shadow had identified proved to be a small cave formed by massive boulders that had tumbled together centuries earlier. The opening was barely large enough for human entry, but the interior provided sufficient space for both Jake and Shadow to escape the storm's fury while retaining body heat. Establishing survival priorities within their cramped refuge required immediate attention to preventing hypothermia and maintaining adequate ventilation. Jake's wet clothing needed to be dried, his body temperature needed to be stabilized, and their shared space needed to be organized for extended occupancy. Shadow's contributions to their survival preparations were remarkable in their sophistication. The wolf used its body heat to warm Jake during the most critical period of temperature stabilization, positioned itself to block cold air infiltration from the cave entrance, and even brought dried vegetation from protected areas to improve their bedding situation. The storm raged for nearly 18 hours, with wind speeds that made any thought of leaving their shelter completely impractical. Jake and Shadow huddled together through the long night, sharing body warmth and finding comfort in each other's presence as the blizzard howled outside their rocky refuge. During the worst hours of the storm, Jake experienced moments of genuine fear about their survival prospects. His emergency supplies included minimal food, no sleeping bag, and clothing that was inadequate for extended exposure to severe cold. Without Shadow's body heat and companionship, hypothermia would have been a serious threat. Shadow's behavior during this crisis period revealed emotional depths that Jake hadn't previously recognized in their relationship. The wolf showed what appeared to be genuine concern for Jake's welfare, checking on his condition regularly and adjusting its position to maximize shared warmth throughout the night. The experience of depending completely on Shadow for survival created new dimensions in their partnership. Jake had rescued Shadow from the avalanche and nursed the wolf through its recovery, but now their roles were reversed. Shadow was providing life-saving assistance to the human who had once been its caretaker. Dawn brought gradual clearing of the storm system, but also revealed the extent of environmental change the blizzard had created. Nearly 3 feet of snow covered the valley floor, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien winter wonderland that would challenge even experienced wilderness survival skills. The pack had weathered the storm successfully, emerging from their own shelters as conditions improved. Their reunion with Shadow was subdued, but clearly carried emotional significance, as if the wolves understood that their family member had chosen to remain with a vulnerable human rather than seek optimal safety with the pack. Jake's assessment of their situation revealed both immediate challenges and longer-term concerns. The unexpected snowfall had created winter conditions that would persist until temperatures rose sufficiently for significant melting. His clothing and equipment remained inadequate for extended exposure, and their food supplies were now critically low. Most significantly, the storm had demonstrated Jake's complete dependence on Shadow for survival in this remote environment. Without the wolf's environmental knowledge and physical assistance, Jake would likely have died during the blizzard. Their partnership had evolved into genuine interdependence that transcended the original rescue relationship. Shadow seemed to understand that their situation required continued cooperation for Jake's survival. The wolf remained close throughout the day following the storm, helping Jake navigate through deep snow and identifying areas where travel was safer. The pack's behavior toward Jake also shifted subtly after the storm. The adult wolves seemed to recognize that Jake had become more than a tolerated observer. He was now a pack member who required ongoing assistance for survival. Their acceptance felt deeper and more committed than the cautious tolerance of his earlier presence. The crisis had transformed Jake's relationship not just with Shadow, but with the entire valley ecosystem. He was no longer an outside observer studying wildlife behavior. He had become part of the community, dependent on its members for survival, and accepted as someone worth protecting. As they faced the challenges of post-storm recovery, Jake realized that his original timeline for returning to civilization was no longer viable. The valley's changed conditions and his demonstrated survival limitations meant that leaving would require careful planning and possibly extended preparation. The blizzard had tested their partnership in ways that revealed its fundamental strength, but it had also created new realities that would shape whatever decisions they made about their shared future in this extraordinary wilderness sanctuary. The morning after the blizzard revealed transformations in the hidden valley that extended far beyond simple weather damage. As Jake and Shadow emerged from their cave shelter into the snow-covered landscape, they discovered evidence of human presence that challenged everything Jake thought he understood about the valley's pristine isolation. Partially buried beneath drifted snow, Jake found remnants of old wooden structures that the storm had exposed by altering drainage patterns and removing accumulated forest debris. These weren't recent constructions, but weathered remnants that suggested human activity in the valley decades or possibly generations earlier. The discovery was both exciting and troubling. Jake's professional training had taught him to recognize historical artifacts and assess their significance for land management decisions. These structural remnants indicated that the valley's untouched wilderness status might be more complex than he had initially assumed. Shadow's reaction to these discoveries was particularly intriguing. Rather than showing the curiosity Jake expected toward unfamiliar objects, the wolf displayed obvious familiarity with the exposed structures. Shadow approached the remnants confidently, investigating specific areas as if following remembered patterns rather than exploring unknown territory. Jake began a systematic survey of the exposed sites, documenting construction techniques and material choices that might indicate when and why humans had established presence in this remote location. The wooden structures showed sophisticated joinery and weatherproofing methods that suggested experienced builders rather than temporary camping arrangements. Most significantly, Jake discovered evidence of deliberate landscape modification that indicated long-term settlement rather than short-term resource extraction. Stone-lined water channels directed spring flow for irrigation purposes, while terraced areas suggested agricultural activities that would have required multiple growing seasons to establish. The implications were staggering from both historical and ecological perspectives. If humans had lived successfully in the valley for extended periods, their activities might have influenced the ecosystem development that Jake had assumed was purely natural. The remarkable predator-prey balance he had observed might partially result from human management practices rather than evolutionary adaptation alone. Shadow's behavior during Jake's archaeological investigations suggested the wolf possessed inherited or learned knowledge about these historical human sites. The animal would lead Jake to specific locations where additional artifacts were likely to be found, demonstrating familiarity that couldn't be explained by casual exploration. Jake's discovery of a partially intact cabin foundation revealed construction details that dated the structure to the early 20th century based on nail types and lumber processing techniques. The building had been substantial enough to support year-round occupation, with foundations for a stone fireplace and evidence of root cellar excavation. The cabin site's location was strategically chosen for both practical and defensive considerations. It commanded excellent views of the valley's main access routes while being protected from severe weather by natural terrain features. The builders had clearly understood mountain survival requirements and possessed significant wilderness experience. Adjacent to the main cabin site, Jake found evidence of smaller outbuildings that suggested a complex settlement arrangement. Root cellars, tool sheds, and what appeared to be animal shelters indicated that the valley's historical inhabitants had developed sophisticated systems for surviving harsh mountain winters. Most intriguingly, Jake discovered carved stone markers that appeared to delineate specific areas within the valley for different purposes. These markers suggested systematic land use planning that recognized the valley's ecological zones and seasonal resource availability patterns. The historical timeline became clearer as Jake's survey expanded. Multiple construction phases were evident, indicating that human presence in the valley had extended over several decades rather than representing a single brief settlement attempt. Each building phase had incorporated lessons learned from previous experience. Jake found artifacts that provided insights into the daily lives of the valley's historical inhabitants. Hand-forged tools, ceramic fragments, and preserved leather goods suggested a self-sufficient lifestyle that required minimal external resources. These people had clearly adapted successfully to mountain isolation. Shadow's continued familiarity with the archaeological sites raised fascinating questions about wolf generational memory and territorial knowledge. The pack's current territories included many of the areas where historical human activity had been concentrated, suggesting possible continuity between past and present land use patterns. The discovery of historical human presence forced Jake to reconsider his assumptions about the valley's ecological significance. Rather than representing purely natural ecosystem development, the remarkable wildlife populations and predator relationships he had observed might reflect the legacy of careful human stewardship spanning multiple generations. Jake began finding evidence that the historical inhabitants had practiced wildlife management techniques that enhanced rather than depleted natural resources. Constructed features that improved water flow, seasonal feeding areas for game animals, and strategic burning patterns that maintained optimal habitat conditions were scattered throughout the valley. The sophistication of these management practices impressed Jake with their ecological understanding. The historical inhabitants had clearly recognized the complex relationships between predator and prey species, seasonal resource availability, and environmental factors that determined ecosystem health. Most remarkably, Jake found evidence suggesting that the historical human inhabitants had developed cooperative relationships with the valley's wolf population. Shared hunting areas, coordinated territorial arrangements, and mutual defense strategies were suggested by artifact patterns and landscape modifications. The possibility that Shadow's pack represented descendants of wolves that had worked cooperatively with humans for generations added new dimensions to Jake's understanding of their remarkable acceptance of his presence. The pack's sophisticated social behaviors and environmental management abilities might reflect hybrid wild domestic knowledge accumulated over multiple generations. Jake's growing understanding of the valley's historical complexity raised new questions about its conservation significance. If the ecosystem he had observed represented successful human-wildlife cooperation rather than purely natural development, protecting its current balance might require different management approaches than traditional wilderness preservation. The archaeological discoveries also created legal and ethical dilemmas about Jake's responsibilities regarding the valley's future. Historical sites of this significance would typically require professional archaeological survey and potential protection under historical preservation regulations. Shadow seemed to understand that Jake's discoveries were creating complex decision-making challenges. The wolf spent increasing time near Jake during his survey activities, providing companionship and support as the implications of their findings became clearer. The hidden valley was revealing itself to be far more complex than Jake had initially understood. Rather than simple pristine wilderness, It represented a unique example of successful long-term cooperation between humans and wildlife that had created ecological conditions impossible to achieve through either pure conservation or traditional management approaches. As Jake concluded his preliminary archaeological survey, he faced decisions about how to balance scientific responsibility, conservation ethics, and the practical challenges of protecting a place whose significance extended far beyond anything he had originally imagined when Shadow first led him to this extraordinary sanctuary. Jake's exploration of the valley's historical sites led to a discovery that would fundamentally change his understanding of both the location's significance and Shadow's mysterious knowledge of the terrain. Following a barely visible trail that connected several archaeological sites, Jake found himself approaching what appeared to be the valley's original entrance route, a concealed passage that explained how early inhabitants had accessed this seemingly isolated sanctuary. The passage was a natural geological formation enhanced by careful human engineering, creating a route that was virtually invisible from the surrounding terrain but provided secure access for those who knew its location. Stonework and strategic vegetation management had disguised the entrance so effectively that Jake might have passed it numerous times without recognition. Shadow's behavior near the passage entrance was revealing. The wolf displayed obvious familiarity with the route, positioning itself at strategic points along the trail as if following well-remembered protocols for safe passage. Jake realized that Shadow's pack had probably been using this route for generations, maintaining knowledge that connected them to the valley's human history. The engineering sophistication of the enhanced passage impressed Jake with its strategic thinking and construction skill. Defensive positions had been incorporated into the route design, allowing small numbers of defenders to control access against much larger forces. The builders had clearly anticipated the need to protect their sanctuary from unwanted intrusion. Jake's survey of the passage revealed evidence of its use spanning multiple decades. Different construction phases showed evolving defensive strategies and improved engineering techniques, suggesting that the route had been continuously maintained and upgraded by successive generations of inhabitants. Most significantly, Jake found carved markers along the passage that appeared to record important events or decisions related to the valley's governance. While he couldn't decipher the symbolic language used, the careful preservation of these records indicated that the historical inhabitants had maintained sophisticated documentation systems. The passage's current condition suggested that it had been used recently, though not by humans. Game trails converge on the route from multiple directions, indicating that wildlife populations throughout the region recognized it as a major travel corridor. The valley's remarkable biodiversity might partially result from its function as a protected wildlife highway. Shadow's pack clearly maintained territorial control over the passage, with scent markings and patrol patterns that secured it against intrusion by competing predator species. Jake realized that the wolves were continuing security responsibilities that had probably been shared with humans for generations. The strategic importance of controlling the passage became apparent as Jake studied topographic relationships between the valley and surrounding terrain. The hidden route provided access to multiple watersheds and hunting territories, making it invaluable for any group seeking to establish regional dominance in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. Jake began understanding why the valley's early inhabitants had been able to maintain their isolated lifestyle successfully. Control of the concealed passage had allowed them to regulate contact with outside populations while accessing resources from a much larger territorial range than the valley itself could provide. The implications for modern wildlife management were substantial. If the passage continued to function as a protected travel corridor for regional animal populations, its preservation would be critical for maintaining genetic diversity and seasonal migration patterns throughout the entire mountain ecosystem. Most intriguingly, Jake found evidence that the passage had been designed to accommodate both human and wolf travel needs simultaneously. Parallel routes at different elevations allowed for species-specific travel while maintaining overall passage security through coordinated monitoring by both human and wolf sentinels. Shadow's current behavior suggested that these cooperative security arrangements might still be partially active. The wolf's positioning during Jake's passage exploration was clearly strategic, providing advance warning about potential threats while maintaining communication with the pack through subtle vocalizations. Jake realized that Shadow had led him to the valley through a much longer and more difficult route than necessary, possibly to test his commitment and capability before revealing the more direct access method. The wolf's decision-making process had been far more sophisticated than Jake had recognized. The discovery of the main passage forced Jake to reconsider the timeline for returning to his normal ranger duties. Knowledge of this concealed route would make future access to the valley much more practical, but it also created new responsibilities for protecting the location from inappropriate intrusion. Jake's professional obligations required him to report significant archaeological discoveries to appropriate authorities, but he was increasingly uncertain about whether such disclosure would serve the valley's best interests. The historical sites and current wildlife populations represented irreplaceable resources that might not survive bureaucratic attention. Shadow seemed to sense Jake's internal conflict about disclosure responsibilities. The wolf's behavior suggested understanding that their shared discoveries carried implications beyond simple scientific interest, and that decisions about the valley's future would affect both human and wolf communities. The passage exploration also revealed the extent of Jake's transformation during his time in the valley. His survival skills had improved dramatically through necessity and Shadow's teaching, while his understanding of wilderness ecosystem function had been revolutionized by direct observation of undisturbed natural processes. Most significantly, Jake's relationship with Shadow had evolved beyond anything he had previously imagined possible between human and wolf. Their partnership now included shared responsibility for protecting secrets that connected past and present, human history and wildlife conservation, individual relationships, and ecosystem preservation. As they prepared to explore the passage's full extent, Jake understood that they were approaching another transition point in their remarkable journey together. The hidden route might provide practical solutions to the challenges of maintaining their partnership while fulfilling external obligations, but would also test their commitment to protecting the valley's extraordinary legacy. The passage represented both opportunity and risk, a way to bridge the gap between the valley's isolated perfection and the outside world's complex demands, but also a potential pathway for forces that might destroy everything they had learned to value during their time in this hidden sanctuary. Jake's decision about how to use knowledge of the concealed route would determine not just their own future, but the fate of an ecosystem and historical site whose significance extended far beyond anything either human or wolf could protect independently. Their partnership had brought them to another crossroads where individual choices would have consequences neither could fully predict or control. The final ascent through the concealed passage brought Jake and Shadow to an overlook that revealed the hidden valley's true magnificence in a way that previous ground-level exploration had never achieved. From this elevated vantage point, Jake could see the complete ecosystem laid out below him like a living map of ecological perfection that had been preserved through generations of careful stewardship. The valley stretched nearly 8 miles from end to end, its boundaries defined by natural cliff walls that created an almost impenetrable barrier to casual discovery. Within this protected amphitheater, Jake could identify at least 7 distinct ecological zones, each supporting different plant communities and wildlife populations that contributed to the remarkable biodiversity he had observed during his weeks of ground-level study. The most striking feature visible from the overlook was a network of crystal-clear streams that flowed from numerous springs scattered throughout the valley floor. These waterways created a complex drainage system that supported lush meadowlands, maintained year-round flowing water, and provided the foundation for an ecosystem that could sustain large predator populations even during harsh mountain winters. Jake's trained eye identified old-growth forest stands that represented centuries of undisturbed development. Massive pines, spruces, and firs formed cathedral-like groves where some individual trees appeared to predate European settlement of North America. These ancient forests provided habitat complexity that supported species diversity impossible in younger or managed woodland areas. Most remarkably, Jake could see evidence of the sophisticated land management practices that historical inhabitants had developed to enhance rather than exploit the valley's natural resources. Carefully maintained clearings provided grazing areas for prey species, while strategic burning patterns had created habitat edges that increased biodiversity and forage availability. The integration of human historical sites with natural landscape features was seamless from this elevated perspective. Rather than disrupting ecosystem function, the valley's early inhabitants had clearly designed their settlements to enhance environmental productivity while maintaining the ecological balance that supported abundant wildlife populations. Shadow's behavior at the overlook demonstrated the wolf's deep, emotional connection to this extraordinary place. The animal stood motionless for long minutes, surveying the valley with obvious pride and satisfaction, as if presenting Jake with a treasured inheritance that represented generations of wolf pack territory and human partnership. Jake began understanding why Shadow had led him through such a circuitous and challenging route to reach the valley initially. The indirect approach had been a test of commitment and capability, ensuring that Jake possessed both the determination and wilderness skills necessary to appreciate and protect what he was being shown. The pack structure visible from the overlook revealed sophisticated territorial organization that maximized resource utilization while minimizing conflict between different predator species. Wolves, bears, and mountain lions had clearly established time-sharing arrangements that allowed multiple apex predators to coexist successfully within the valley's rich but limited ecosystem. Wildlife movement patterns were clearly visible from the elevated viewing position, with game trails connecting different ecological zones in ways that provided prey species with optimal access to seasonal resources while maintaining escape routes from predatory pressure. The valley's design seemed almost intentionally crafted to support maximum biodiversity. Jake's professional assessment of the valley's conservation significance was overwhelmed by its scope and complexity. This wasn't simply a pristine wilderness area that had escaped human impact. It was a functioning example of how human knowledge and natural processes could work together to create ecological conditions superior to either pure wilderness or traditional management approaches. The discovery of extensive beaver engineering throughout the valley's drainage system added another layer to Jake's understanding of ecosystem management complexity. Multiple beaver colonies had created pond systems that regulated water flow, prevented erosion, and provided habitat for species that wouldn't otherwise survive at this elevation. The collaborative relationship between human historical management, wolf pack territorial behavior, and beaver engineering represented a level of ecosystem integration that challenged fundamental assumptions about wilderness conservation and predator management that Jake had accepted throughout his career. Most significantly, Jake realized that the valley represented a unique refuge for species and ecological relationships that had been eliminated elsewhere by habitat fragmentation and human interference. The complete predator-prey community he had observed was probably one of the last intact examples of Rocky Mountain ecosystem function as it had existed before European settlement. The scientific value of protecting and studying this ecosystem was incalculable, but Jake's growing understanding of its significance also created overwhelming responsibility for making decisions about its future. Knowledge of the valley's location and resources would inevitably attract attention from researchers, developers, and government agencies whose interests might not align with preservation priorities. Shadow seemed to understand the weight of these considerations as Jake struggled with implications of their discoveries. The wolf remained close during Jake's extended contemplation at the overlook, providing companionship and support as he processed the magnitude of what they had found together. The valley's isolation had been its protection for generations, but Jake's presence represented the beginning of outside contact that could either enhance its preservation or lead to its destruction. His decisions about disclosure and access would determine whether this extraordinary place could continue functioning according to its ancient patterns or would be transformed by modern intervention. Jake's emotional connection to the valley had deepened beyond professional interest into something approaching reverence. The months of shared discovery with Shadow had created bonds not just between human and wolf, but between both of them and a place that represented ecological perfection achieved through centuries of careful stewardship. The practical challenges of protecting the valley while fulfilling his obligations as a park ranger were becoming clearer as Jake's understanding of its significance increased. Traditional wilderness management approaches would be inadequate for preserving the complex relationships that made this ecosystem unique. Most critically, Jake realized that the valley's continued health depended on maintaining the wolf pack's territorial control and ecological knowledge that connected current conditions to historical management practices. Shadow's pack wasn't just wildlife occupying habitat. They were active participants in ecosystem management that human intervention might disrupt irreparably. The Overlook had provided Jake with perspective on both the valley's extraordinary significance and the enormous responsibility that knowledge of its existence created. As he prepared to descend back into the sanctuary that had become his temporary home, Jake understood that his time as a passive observer was ending. Soon he would need to make decisions about how to balance scientific responsibility, conservation ethics, legal obligations, and personal loyalty to Shadow and the remarkable community they had discovered together. The valley had revealed its secrets, but protecting those secrets would require wisdom and courage that Jake hoped their partnership had prepared him to provide. The hidden sanctuary spread below them represented both the culmination of their journey together and the beginning of challenges that would test everything they had learned about trust, loyalty, and the complex relationships between human knowledge and natural wisdom that had created this extraordinary place. The descent from the Overlook brought Jake and Shadow directly into the heart of Wolfpack's social dynamics that would challenge everything Jake thought he understood about their relationship and his role in the valley's complex community. As they approached the main pack gathering area, Jake realized he was about to witness the formal integration process that would determine Shadow's permanent status within the family hierarchy. The pack had assembled in a natural amphitheater formed by massive boulder formations, creating an arena where important social decisions were traditionally conducted. 7 adults and 4 juveniles formed a loose circle around the area where Shadow would need to demonstrate its growth and capabilities since the months-long separation from pack life. Jake positioned himself at a respectful distance where he could observe without interfering, understanding that this ceremony represented ancient wolf protocols that had governed Pack's social structure for countless generations. Shadow's success or failure in this integration process would determine not just its individual future, but the nature of any continuing relationship between Jake and the wolf community. The ritual began with complex scent exchanges that conveyed information about Shadow's experiences during its absence from the pack. Each adult wolf investigated Shadow thoroughly, processing chemical evidence of its months of human contact, recovery from injury, and development of new survival capabilities. Jake watched this evaluation process with fascination and growing anxiety. Shadow's scent clearly carried human associations that might be interpreted as contamination by pack members who had maintained pure wild status throughout their lives. The question of whether these foreign influences would be accepted or rejected was central to Shadow's reintegration prospects. The pack's response to Shadow's altered scent profile was complex and nuanced rather than simply positive or negative. Individual wolves showed different reactions, with some displaying curiosity about Shadow's unusual experiences, while others maintained cautious distance from these unfamiliar chemical signatures. Most significantly, the pack's alpha female approached Shadow with obvious recognition and emotional warmth that suggested deep family bonds transcending concerns about human contact. Her acceptance seemed to influence other pack members' attitudes, creating a foundation for Shadow's potential reintegration despite its unconventional recent history. Jake realized he was witnessing Shadow's reunion with its mother, a relationship that had survived months of separation and uncertainty about the young wolf's survival. The emotional intensity of this reunion was obvious even to Jake's human perception, with both wolves displaying behaviors that indicated profound relief and joy at being reunited. The presence of Shadow's mother within the pack hierarchy explained much about the group's previous tolerance of Jake's presence in their territory. The alpha female had apparently made decisions about accepting the human who had saved her offspring, extending pack protection to Jake based on his role in Shadow's survival and recovery. As the scent evaluation process continued, Jake observed subtle power dynamics within the pack that revealed sophisticated social organization beyond simple dominance hierarchies. Different wolves specialized in various pack functions: hunting coordination, territorial security, young animal education, and resource management, creating a complex community structure. Shadow's integration challenges became apparent as the pack assessed its current capabilities against the standards expected of wolves that had never left pack society. The young wolf needed to demonstrate hunting skills, territorial awareness, and social cooperation that met adult pack member expectations. The first test involved Shadow's ability to coordinate with pack hunting strategies that had evolved during its absence. The group organized a mock hunt that required precise timing and communication between multiple participants, testing Shadow's ability to interpret pack signals and contribute effectively to collective efforts. Shadow's performance in this coordinated exercise was impressive, demonstrating that its months of wilderness education with Jake had actually enhanced rather than diminished its value to pack hunting success. The young wolf's improved problem-solving abilities and environmental awareness contributed new tactical options to traditional pack strategies. Jake felt profound pride watching Shadow excel in these integration challenges while also experiencing sharp awareness that successful reintegration might mean the end of their partnership. If Shadow proved capable of full pack membership, the wolf would no longer need human companionship for survival or social fulfillment. The pack's evaluation process extended through multiple days, with different tests assessing various aspects of Shadow's development and commitment to pack society. Territorial patrol duties, resource-sharing protocols, and conflict resolution skills were all evaluated through practical demonstrations rather than simple behavioral observation. Most remarkably, Jake discovered that Shadow's unique experiences were being valued rather than simply tolerated by the pack community. The young wolf's knowledge of human behavior and environmental analysis capabilities were recognized as assets that enhanced overall pack security and survival prospects. The integration process also revealed the extent to which Jake had been accepted as an honorary pack member during his time in the valley. Individual wolves approached him during rest periods, sharing food and seeking companionship in ways that indicated genuine social bonds rather than simple tolerance of his presence. Jake began understanding that his relationship with Shadow had created connections to the entire pack community that transcended typical human-wildlife interactions. He had become part of their extended social network, with responsibilities and privileges that reflected genuine membership rather than guest status. The complexity of these relationships forced Jake to reconsider his assumptions about the boundaries between human and wolf communities. The pack's acceptance suggested that such boundaries might be more flexible than traditional wildlife management approaches assumed, opening possibilities for cooperation that extended beyond individual animal-human partnerships. Shadow's successful integration was confirmed through a final ceremony that involved the entire pack in celebratory howling that echoed throughout the valley. Jake realized he was witnessing not just Shadow's acceptance, but recognition of the young wolf's enhanced status as a pack member whose unique experiences had increased its value to the community. The conclusion of Shadow's integration process created new questions about Jake's own role in the valley's social structure. His partnership with Shadow had been based on the wolf's need for human assistance, but now that Shadow was fully capable of independent survival within pack society, their relationship needed redefinition. Jake's emotional response to Shadow's successful reintegration was complex, combining pride in the wolf's achievements with uncertainty about their shared future. The young wolf had accomplished everything Jake had hoped for during the long months of recovery and education, but success brought its own challenges for their continuing partnership. As the pack celebration continued into the night, Jake understood that he had reached another transition point in his extraordinary journey with Shadow. The wolf's reintegration represented the successful conclusion of their original rehabilitation relationship, but it also opened possibilities for new kinds of cooperation that neither human nor wolf had previously imagined. The valley had accepted both Shadow and Jake as community members, creating opportunities for continued partnership that transcended traditional boundaries between human and wolf societies while honoring the essential nature of both species. The weeks following Shadow's successful reintegration into the pack revealed aspects of wolf society that challenged fundamental assumptions about predator behavior and pack dynamics that Jake had accepted throughout his career in wildlife management. Rather than experiencing rejection or marginalization due to its months of human contact, Shadow had been elevated to a position of special status within the pack hierarchy. The young wolf's unique combination of traditional pack knowledge and human-influenced environmental analysis capabilities made it an invaluable resource for pack decision-making processes. Shadow served as an interpreter between the pack's instinctive behaviors and the complex challenges posed by an ecosystem that included historical human modifications and current human presence. Jake observed Shadow participating in pack leadership councils where important territorial and resource management decisions were debated through complex communication methods that combined vocalizations, scent marking, and sophisticated body language. The young wolf's contributions to these discussions were clearly valued by the adult pack members. Most remarkably, Shadow had assumed responsibility for managing the pack's relationship with Jake, serving as a liaison between human and wolf communities in ways that benefited both species. The wolf would interpret Jake's needs and limitations to pack members while also communicating pack decisions and priorities to Jake through behavioral cues he had learned to recognize. This liaison role represented a completely new category of wolf behavior that hadn't been documented in wildlife management literature. Shadow was functioning as a cultural bridge between species, facilitating cooperation that enhanced survival prospects for both human and wolf communities without compromising the essential nature of either. Jake's integration into pack society continued evolving as individual wolves developed personal relationships with him based on shared experiences and mutual benefit. Different pack members specialized in teaching Jake various wilderness survival skills, while Jake contributed human knowledge about weather prediction, resource conservation, and environmental analysis. The educational exchange between Jake and the pack was genuinely bidirectional, with both human and wolf knowledge systems contributing to enhanced understanding of valley ecology and survival strategies. Jake's analytical abilities complemented wolf sensory capabilities, creating problem-solving approaches that neither species could achieve independently. Pack hunting expeditions became collaborative efforts that incorporated Jake's human perspective on prey behavior and environmental factors, while maintaining traditional wolf tactical approaches. These hybrid strategies proved remarkably effective, increasing hunting success rates while reducing energy expenditure and injury risks for pack members. Jake's participation in pack activities wasn't simply tolerated accommodation of his limitations. It was active inclusion based on recognition of his contributions to community welfare. Individual wolves sought his companionship during rest periods, included him in territorial patrol duties, and even requested his assistance with complex problem-solving challenges. The pack's acceptance of Jake also extended to protection behaviors that indicated genuine emotional bonds rather than simple cooperative arrangements. When Jake's activities took him into potentially dangerous areas of the valley, pack members would position themselves to provide security and assistance if threats developed. Most significantly, Jake discovered that the pack maintained collective memory of the valley's historical human inhabitants through behavioral traditions that have been passed down through multiple generations. Certain territorial boundaries, resource management practices, and seasonal activity patterns reflected knowledge that had been shared between humans and wolves decades earlier. This generational memory explained much about the pack's immediate acceptance of Jake's presence and their sophisticated approaches to ecosystem management. The wolves weren't just wild animals occupying habitat. They were inheritors of collaborative management traditions that had been developed through generations of human-wolf cooperation. Jake began documenting behavioral patterns and ecological relationships that represented unique examples of successful long-term cooperation between human and wolf communities. The valley's current ecosystem health resulted from collaborative management approaches that have been maintained by wolf packs even after human inhabitants had departed. The scientific implications of these discoveries were revolutionary for wildlife management policy and conservation strategy. The valley demonstrated that human-wolf cooperation could enhance rather than degrade natural ecosystem function, challenging fundamental assumptions about the incompatibility of human presence and wilderness preservation. Jake's role as both participant and observer in this unique community created ethical dilemmas about his responsibilities for protecting and documenting what he was experiencing. The pack's trust and acceptance carried obligations that might conflict with his professional duties as a park ranger and his potential responsibilities to the scientific community. Most critically, Jake realized that his presence in the valley was no longer temporary accommodation of emergency circumstances. He had become a permanent member of a community whose continued health depended on maintaining the complex relationships between human knowledge, wolf social organization, and ecosystem management that had been developed over generations. The practical implications of this realization were overwhelming. Jake's normal career as a park ranger operating from an isolated cabin would need to be fundamentally restructured to accommodate his new role as a participant in valley community life and his responsibilities for protecting the extraordinary relationships he had discovered. Shadow's position as cultural liaison between human and wolf communities represented both opportunity and challenge for Jake's future planning. The young wolf could facilitate communication and cooperation, but the success of their continued partnership would depend on Jake's ability to fulfill his obligations to both human society and wolf pack community. The Valley's pack had accepted Jake not as a temporary guest, but as a permanent community member whose knowledge and capabilities enhanced their collective survival prospects. This acceptance created responsibilities and opportunities that would fundamentally change the direction of Jake's life and career. As summer advanced toward autumn, Jake understood that he was approaching decision points about his future that would affect not just his own life, but the welfare of an entire ecosystem and the remarkable community of wolves that had welcomed him into their ancient society. The integration process that had begun with Shadow's return to pack life had evolved into Jake's own integration into a form of human-wolf cooperation that represented successful models for conservation approaches that most wildlife management professionals considered impossible. The Hidden Valley had revealed not just an intact predator-prey ecosystem, but a functioning example of how human knowledge and wolf social organization could work together to create ecological conditions that neither species could maintain independently. Jake's systematic exploration of the valley's botanical treasures began during the late summer months, when plant communities were at their peak development, revealing the true scope of biodiversity that had been preserved within this protected ecosystem. What he discovered challenged not only his understanding of Rocky Mountain flora, but also fundamental assumptions about species distribution and conservation in high-altitude environments. The first remarkable discovery came during a routine survey of meadowland areas, where Jake had noticed unusual flowering patterns that didn't match his extensive knowledge of regional plant communities. Scattered throughout the valley's grasslands were populations of rare medicinal plants that had been considered nearly extinct throughout their historical range. Mountain arnica grew in abundance, where Jake would have expected to find only common alpine flowers, while wild ginseng populations flourished in forest understory conditions that shouldn't have supported their survival at this elevation. Most significantly, Jake identified several plant species that weren't supposed to exist anywhere in the Rocky Mountain region. The pack showed obvious familiarity with these unusual botanical resources, with individual wolves demonstrating knowledge of specific plants that could treat various ailments or provide nutritional supplements during seasonal resource scarcity. Shadow served as Jake's guide to understanding wolf medicinal practices that represented generations of accumulated knowledge about plant properties. Jake began documenting sophisticated relationships between the valley's wildlife populations and rare plant communities that suggested coevolutionary development over extended time periods. Certain flowering plants had clearly adapted to pollination by specific insect species that were themselves supported by the valley's unique microclimate conditions. The presence of healing springs throughout the valley added another dimension to its medicinal significance. These natural water sources contained mineral concentrations that created therapeutic properties recognized by wildlife populations and evidently by the valley's historical human inhabitants as well. Jake discovered evidence of systematic cultivation practices around several spring locations where rare medicinal plants have been encouraged to establish populations through careful soil management and protective cultivation techniques. The historical inhabitants had clearly understood the therapeutic value of these resources and had worked to enhance their availability. Most remarkably, Jake found plant species that had been considered extinct in North America for decades, surviving in the valley's protected environment where they had been maintained through careful stewardship by both human inhabitants and wildlife populations working in cooperation. The botanical diversity extended beyond medicinal plants to include food species that had sustained both human and animal populations during harsh winter conditions. While grains, root vegetables, and fruit-producing shrubs grew in carefully maintained plots that showed evidence of selective breeding and cultivation over multiple generations. Jake's analysis of seed varieties and plant genetics suggested that the valley had served as a repository for agricultural knowledge and genetic diversity that had been lost elsewhere due to habitat destruction and climate change. The preserved plant communities represented irreplaceable resources for both conservation biology and agricultural development. The integration of cultivated and wild plant communities was seamless, with managed areas transitioning gradually into natural habitat without obvious boundaries between human-influenced and purely wild vegetation. This integration had created enhanced biodiversity that supported richer wildlife populations than either pure cultivation or unmanaged wilderness could achieve. Shadow's pack demonstrated detailed knowledge of seasonal plant availability and optimal harvesting techniques that maximized resource utilization while ensuring continued plant population health. The wolves had inherited botanical knowledge that complemented their predatory skills with sophisticated understanding of plant resources. Jake began understanding that the valley's remarkable ecosystem health resulted partly from this integration of plant cultivation, wildlife management, and natural ecological processes that have been maintained through collaborative efforts between human inhabitants and wolf pack territorial behavior. The medicinal spring systems were particularly sophisticated, with multiple water sources providing different therapeutic benefits based on varying mineral concentrations and temperature characteristics. Wildlife populations clearly understood these distinctions, utilizing different springs for specific health needs. Jake's documentation of plant-wildlife relationships revealed that many of the valley's rare species had survived because they served important functions in the complex web of relationships between predator species, prey animals, and environmental health maintenance. The botanical diversity wasn't accidental. It was functionally necessary for ecosystem stability. The discovery of these irreplaceable botanical resources created new dimensions in Jake's concerns about protecting the valley's secrets. The rare and extinct plant species alone would attract scientific attention that might compromise the ecosystem's continued health if their location became widely known. Most critically, Jake realized that many of the valley's medicinal plants and healing springs represented resources that could benefit human health significantly if properly studied and preserved. The knowledge held by Shadow's pack about plant properties and therapeutic applications represented medical wisdom that had been lost in most human societies. The ethical implications of this botanical treasure trove were staggering. Jake possessed knowledge of medical resources that could potentially help countless people, but revealing their location might lead to exploitation that would destroy the very conditions that had allowed these plants to survive. Jake's role as protector of the valley's secrets was becoming increasingly complex as he understood more fully the scope of what had been preserved in this hidden sanctuary. The botanical resources alone justified extraordinary conservation efforts, but protecting them required maintaining the complex relationships that supported their survival. The valley represented a living library of botanical knowledge and genetic diversity that had been preserved through centuries of careful stewardship by both human and wolf communities working in cooperation. Jake had become the inheritor of this precious legacy, but he was also its most vulnerable guardian. As autumn approached and Jake contemplated his future responsibilities, he understood that the valley's botanical treasures represented both its greatest value and its most serious conservation challenge. The plants, springs, and accumulated knowledge about their use constituted irreplaceable resources that humanity could not afford to lose. Shadow seemed to understand the weight of these botanical discoveries and Jake's concerns about protecting them appropriately. The young wolf had guided Jake to many of the most significant plant communities, as if ensuring that human knowledge would be available to complement wolf wisdom about the valley's remarkable medicinal resources. The hidden sanctuary had revealed itself to be not just an intact ecosystem, but a repository of botanical treasures and therapeutic knowledge that had been preserved against impossible odds through the dedication of both human and wolf guardians working across generations. The crisp September morning that would change everything began like dozens of others Jake had experienced in the Hidden Valley, with Shadow serving as his guide through the pack's daily territorial routines. But as they approached an area of the valley Jake had never fully explored, Shadow's behavior shifted dramatically, displaying the kind of purposeful excitement that had characterized their first journey to this extraordinary place. Shadow led Jake to a section of the valley where ancient rock formations created natural shelters and viewing areas that commanded sweeping perspectives of the entire ecosystem. From this elevated position, Jake could see the complete scope of what had been preserved within the valley's protective boundaries, a functioning model of wilderness ecosystem relationships as they had existed before human interference began fragmenting natural habitats throughout North America. The revelation that struck Jake with overwhelming force was the understanding that everything he had discovered, the intact predator-prey relationships, the rare botanical communities, the sophisticated wolf pack social organization, the evidence of successful human-wildlife cooperation, represented not just scientific curiosities, but a comprehensive blueprint for wilderness conservation that could revolutionize environmental management throughout the continent. The valley wasn't simply a place that had been protected from destruction. It was a demonstration of how natural systems could function when all their essential components were preserved and allowed to interact according to evolutionary patterns developed over millennia. The ecosystem health Jake had observed resulted from completeness rather than just protection. Shadow's pack had brought Jake to this realization gradually, allowing him to understand each component of the valley's significance before revealing the larger pattern that connected all these discoveries into a coherent vision of what wilderness preservation could accomplish under ideal conditions. Jake's professional background had given him the analytical tools necessary to recognize the valley's significance. But his emotional journey with Shadow had provided the personal commitment necessary to understand his responsibilities as its guardian. The wolf had prepared him for this moment of recognition through months of shared experience and growing trust. The practical implications of this understanding were both inspiring and overwhelming. If the valley's conservation model could be replicated elsewhere, protected ecosystems throughout North America could be restored to functional completeness that would provide genuine wildlife habitat while also serving human needs for natural resources and environmental services. But replication would require fundamental changes in wildlife management philosophy, conservation funding priorities, and legal frameworks for protecting wilderness areas. The valley's success had depended on isolation and continuity of management approaches that would be difficult to achieve under modern regulatory systems. Most critically, Jake realized that his unique position as the only outside observer with detailed knowledge of the valley's ecosystem relationships created extraordinary responsibilities for ensuring that this knowledge would be used appropriately for conservation benefit rather than simply academic advancement. Shadow seemed to understand that Jake had reached the moment of full comprehension about the valley's significance and his own role as its protector. The wolf's behavior carried emotional undertones that suggested pride in their shared accomplishments and confidence in Jake's commitment to making decisions that would serve the valley's long-term welfare. Jake's transformation during his months in the valley had prepared him for this responsibility in ways he was only beginning to understand. His wilderness survival skills had reached levels that would allow him to live permanently in the ecosystem he had learned to love. His understanding of wolf social organization had given him the knowledge necessary to maintain his role as liaison between human and wolf communities. Most importantly, his partnership with Shadow had demonstrated that successful cooperation between human and wolf intelligence could enhance environmental management in ways that neither species could achieve independently. Their relationship had become a model for the kind of collaboration that had originally created the valley's remarkable ecosystem health. Jake's decision about the valley's future crystallized as he stood on the ancient rock formation with Shadow beside him, surveying the complete ecosystem that had become their shared home. He would return to his former role as a park ranger, but with a fundamentally different mission that honored his new understanding of conservation possibilities. Rather than managing wilderness areas according to traditional bureaucratic approaches that emphasize human recreation and resource extraction, Jake would work to protect and gradually expand habitat conditions that could support complete ecosystem relationships like those preserved in the Hidden Valley. His official reports would describe general ecological principles and conservation strategies without revealing the valley's specific location or the detailed knowledge that would make it vulnerable to inappropriate intrusion. The sanctuary's protection would depend on maintaining its secrets while applying its lessons to broader conservation efforts. Shadow's role in Jake's new mission would continue through their partnership, with the wolf serving as Jake's connection to natural wisdom that complemented human analytical capabilities. Their collaboration had proven that human-wolf cooperation could enhance environmental management without compromising the essential nature of either species. The valley's wolf pack had accepted Jake as a permanent community member whose responsibilities included representing their interests in the larger world beyond their protected territory. This commitment would guide Jake's career decisions and conservation advocacy throughout his remaining years as a wildlife professional. Jake's months of transformation in the Hidden Valley had prepared him to become an advocate for conservation approaches that honored both scientific knowledge and natural wisdom, human needs and wildlife welfare, immediate practical concerns, and long-term ecosystem health. The young wolf that Jake had rescued from avalanche debris had led him to discoveries that would shape the rest of his life and potentially influence conservation policy throughout North America. Shadow had fulfilled its promise of showing Jake something remarkable, but the responsibility for protecting and applying that knowledge now belonged to their continuing partnership. As Jake prepared to begin his new mission as guardian of the valley's secrets and advocate for its conservation lessons, he understood that his rescue of Shadow had actually been Shadow's rescue of him from a limited understanding of what conservation could accomplish when human knowledge and natural wisdom worked together toward shared goals. The Hidden Valley would remain protected through Jake's commitment to keeping its location secret, but its lessons would spread through his work to create similar sanctuaries where complete ecosystem relationships could be restored and maintained for the benefit of both human and wildlife communities. Jake's journey with Shadow had ended where it began, with a commitment to protecting life and preserving the natural relationships that make life possible. But now that commitment encompassed not just individual rescue, but the preservation of an entire world of ecological relationships that represented hope for the future of wilderness conservation. Standing beside Shadow in the place that had become their permanent home, Jake understood that their partnership had become something larger than either human or wolf. It had become a living demonstration of what was possible when different species worked together to protect the natural world they shared.